Hello there, and welcome. Maybe you've had a long day, or perhaps you simply find peace in stories of distant places and forgotten explorers. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as the weight of the day begins to lift. Tonight we travel into the green heart of South America, into the world's largest rainforest, following a man who walked where maps ended and mystery began. A British surveyor named Percy Harrison Fawcett, who spent years charting one of Earth's most formidable landscapes. The Amazon rainforest. A realm of emerald shadows and endless rivers, where the air itself seems to breathe. Fawcett knew this place not as tourists know it, not as scientists in research stations experience it, but as an explorer confronting nature at its most overwhelming. He walked through forests so dense that darkness reigned at midday. He navigated rivers that could swallow a man whole. He mapped territory where every step forward meant pushing through walls of vegetation, crossing swamps that seemed bottomless, and enduring heat that made the very air shimmer. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into history and landscape, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our descent into the green world that Percy Fawcett called both magnificent and hellish. Percy Harrison Fawcett was born in 1867 in Torquay, Devon, England. He came from a family with connections to exploration and adventure, his godfather being the writer H. Rider Haggard, author of tales about lost civilizations and hidden kingdoms. Perhaps this early influence planted seeds that would later bloom into obsession. Fawcett joined the Royal Artillery and later trained as a surveyor, skills that would prove essential in the unmapped wilderness of South America. By the time he received his first commission to survey the Amazon in 1906, Fawcett was 39 years old, a seasoned military man with experience in Ceylon, where he had worked on railway and road surveys. But nothing could truly prepare someone for the Amazon. The jungle there operated by different rules, governed by forces that seemed designed to resist human intrusion. It was a place where compasses malfunctioned near magnetic ore deposits, where rivers changed course seasonally, and where the very ground could shift from solid to liquid in moments. The early 20th century was an age when the world's blank spaces were rapidly shrinking. Antarctica was being probed by expeditions from multiple nations. The Arctic had drawn explorers northward for decades. Africa's interior, once mysterious, was being carved into colonial territories. But the Amazon remained stubbornly unknown. Oh, the rivers had names, at least the major ones. The main channel of the Amazon itself had been navigated for centuries. But venture away from those liquid highways into the forest itself, and you entered territory where European maps offered nothing but speculation. South American nations needed boundaries. Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru all claimed overlapping territories in the Amazon basin, region so remote that no one knew precisely where one nation's land ended and another's began. These were not mere academic questions. Rubber was becoming increasingly valuable, and the Amazon held vast rubber-producing regions. Whoever controlled these areas controlled wealth. But first, someone had to go there and actually determine where the borders should fall. The Royal Geographical Society in London, an institution that had sponsored countless expeditions, was approached by the Bolivian government. They needed a surveyor, someone who could venture into the borderlands between Bolivia and Brazil, follow rivers that appeared on no reliable maps, take astronomical observations to fix positions, and return with data accurate enough to settle international disputes. The society recommended Percy Fawcett. What drew Fawcett to accept? Certainly duty and employment played roles. But reading his own words, written in letters and journals, reveals something deeper. He was captivated by the unknown. The idea of walking where civilization had not reached, of seeing landscapes that existed outside human record, stirred something in him. The Amazon represented Earth's greatest terrestrial mystery, a place so vast and complex that it seemed to actively resist being known. Before we follow Fawcett into the forest, we must understand the landscape itself. The Amazon is not simply a large jungle. It is a phenomenon of planetary scale, a living system so immense that it influences weather patterns across continents and produces roughly 10% of Earth's oxygen. To call it impressive understates reality. The Amazon is overwhelming. The Amazon basin covers roughly 7 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, it's nearly as large as the continental United States. The rainforest itself, while slightly smaller, still encompasses about 5.5 million square kilometers, spreading across 9 nations with Brazil holding the majority. Within this expanse flow rivers totaling more than 6,000 kilometers in length, with the Amazon River itself ranking as either the longest or second longest river on Earth, depending on how you measure and where you mark its origin. But numbers, while staggering, cannot capture what the Amazon actually feels like. Imagine standing at the edge of the forest. Before you rises a wall of green that seems solid, impenetrable. The air is heavy with moisture, clinging to your skin, filling your lungs with every breath. The temperature hovers around 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher, and the humidity rarely drops below 80%. Within minutes of exertion, sweat soaks through clothing. Within an hour, everything you carry feels damp. The forest did not appear overnight. Its story stretches back millions of years, to times when South America was an island continent, isolated from North America and developing unique ecosystems. About 55 million years ago, during a period of global warmth, tropical forests spread across the world. The Amazon basin, bounded by the Andes Mountains to the west and the Brazilian and Guiana shields to the south and north, became a perfect cradle for rainforest development. As the Andes rose, pushed upward by the collision of tectonic plates, they created a barrier that trapped moisture flowing westward from the Atlantic. Rain fell abundantly, feeding rivers that eventually carved the landscape into the form Fawcett would encounter. The Amazon River once flowed westward, toward the Pacific, but the rising Andes blocked that path. The river reversed course, creating the eastward-flowing giant we know today, carrying more water than the next 7 largest rivers combined. This geological history created the terrain Fawcett would navigate. The western Amazon, nearest the Andes, features relatively young, nutrient-rich soils washed down from the mountains. The central and eastern Amazon, older geologically, has heavily weathered soils leached of nutrients by millions of years of rain. Yet somehow, impossibly, the forest thrives on these poor soils through an intricate recycling system that keeps nutrients circulating between living and dead matter, never allowing them to escape into the earth. The rivers tell their own stories through their colors. The Amazon's major tributaries divide into 3 types, each reflecting different landscapes upstream. Whitewater rivers, like the main Amazon Channel and the Madeira River, carry heavy loads of sediment eroded from the Andes. These rivers run tan or brown, their waters thick with dissolved minerals and suspended particles. They carry life, fertilizing the floodplains during annual inundations. Blackwater rivers, like the Rio Negro, flow from the ancient Guiana and Brazilian shields to the north and south. These rivers pass through forests growing on sandy, infertile soils. Fallen leaves decay in the water, releasing tannins that stain it the color of dark tea. Blackwater rivers are acidic and low in nutrients, supporting fewer fish but creating hauntingly beautiful waterscapes where the dark water reflects the sky like obsidian mirrors. Clear water rivers, less common, run through rocky terrain where sediment settles quickly. They appear greenish or blue, transparent enough to see the bottom in shallow areas. Each river type supports different communities of fish, plants, and other organisms, adding to the Amazon's staggering biodiversity. The climate of the Amazon operates on patterns that seem designed to maximize moisture. Near the equator, the sun's energy drives enormous evaporation from the forest canopy and river surfaces. This moisture rises, cools, and condenses into towering clouds that release torrential rains almost daily. A typical year sees between 2 and 3 meters of rainfall, though some areas receive considerably more. But the Amazon creates much of its own rain through a process scientists call the flying rivers. Trees draw water from the soil through their roots and release it through their leaves in a process called transpiration. The Amazon's trees collectively release about 20 billion tons of water vapor into the atmosphere every single day. This moisture forms clouds that travel westward on prevailing winds, reaching the Andes and falling again as rain, which flows back through the forest in rivers, completing the cycle. This system means the forest sustains itself. Remove too much forest, and the flying rivers diminish. Less moisture means less rain, which means more stress on remaining trees, which leads to more forest loss in a terrible feedback loop. But in Fawcett's time, such concepts were unknown. The forest seemed infinite, eternal, unconquerable. Percy Fawcett arrived in South America in 1906, stepping off a ship into the heat and chaos of a Brazilian port. His commission was straightforward in description but monumentally difficult in execution. He was to survey the border between Bolivia and Brazil in a region where both nations claimed territory but neither had established clear presence. This meant traveling up the Rio Verde, Rio Abuna, and eventually the Rio Acre, rivers that appeared on maps as speculative lines drawn by cartographers who had never seen them. Fawcett gathered a team. He needed men who could endure hardship, who wouldn't panic when faced with danger, and who had skills useful in the wilderness. He hired local guides who knew at least the lower reaches of the rivers. He obtained a boat, though calling it such is generous. It was a vessel barely capable of fighting the current, prone to grounding on sandbars and catching on submerged logs. The expedition pushed off, entering the network of waterways that would carry them deeper into the interior. From the very first days, the Amazon made its nature clear. The heat was relentless. Even on the river, where one might expect breeze, the air hung still and thick. The sun hammered down during the day, turning the boat into an oven. At night, clouds of insects descended, biting every exposed inch of skin. The riverbanks presented a continuous wall of vegetation. Trees crowded to the water's edge, their roots extending into the current, their branches creating a canopy that arched overhead. Behind this front line of trees stretched the forest proper, a realm of shadows and strange sounds. Howler monkeys roared from the canopy, their calls carrying for kilometers, sounding like wind through enormous pipes. Birds screamed and chattered. At night, the forest produced a symphony of frog calls, insect chirps, and mysterious rustlings. Navigation proved more difficult than anticipated. The rivers twisted constantly, looping back on themselves in meanders that could add days to the journey. Sandbanks appeared without warning, shifting with each flood and dry season. What might have been deep water on one expedition could be impassable shallows the next. Fawcett learned to read subtle signs in the water's surface, to distinguish the smooth glide of deep channels from the rippled texture of hidden obstacles. Rapids presented serious dangers. In some stretches, the river narrowed and accelerated, rushing over rocks and fallen trees. The roar could be heard from a distance, a warning that careful navigation or portaging would be necessary. Getting it wrong meant capsizing, losing supplies, possibly drowning in churning water far from any help. Fawcett and his men would sometimes spend an entire day negotiating a single rapid, carefully guiding their boat through the safest channel or, if none existed, unloading everything and carrying it overland while floating the empty boat through. The landscape began to reveal its character. This was not uniform jungle. The forest changed constantly, responding to subtle variations in elevation, soil, and water. Along the rivers, during the dry season, beaches appeared, exposing sand or mud. But when the rains came, water levels could rise 10 or 15 meters, flooding forests that remained underwater for months. These seasonally flooded forests, called varzea along whitewater rivers and igapo along blackwater rivers, developed unique characteristics. Trees adapted to survive with their roots submerged for half the year. Fish swam through the forest, feeding on fruits and seeds that fell from trees. Away from the rivers, on higher ground that floods rarely reached, the terra firma forest dominated. Here the trees grew tallest, competing viciously for light. The canopy, 30 to 40 meters above the ground, formed a continuous roof of leaves. Occasionally, emergent trees broke through this ceiling, reaching 50 or even 60 meters, towering above their neighbors like giant surveying kingdoms. Beneath the canopy, conditions changed dramatically. Light levels dropped to 1 or 2% of full sunlight. The understory, contrary to popular imagination, was often relatively open. Dense undergrowth only appeared where light penetrated, in clearings created by fallen trees or along rivers. In the deep forest, one could sometimes walk between the trees, though progress was still difficult due to roots, vines, and the sheer disorientation of being surrounded by trunks in every direction. Fawcett recorded his observations with a surveyor's precision. He took astronomical sights whenever possible, using a sextant to measure the angles of celestial bodies and calculate his position. This required clear sky, which was often unavailable under the forest canopy. He had to find clearings or river bends where the view opened. Even then, sudden storms could ruin observations. But slowly, painfully, he accumulated data points, fixing positions that would allow accurate maps to be drawn. The expedition encountered indigenous peoples, though interactions were fraught with tension. Some groups were peaceful, curious about these strange visitors. Others were hostile, understandably so given the history of violence and disease that Europeans had brought to the Americas. Fawcett developed a policy of attempting friendly contact, approaching slowly, offering gifts, trying to communicate peaceful intentions. Sometimes this worked. Other times, arrows flew from the forest, forcing retreat. These indigenous inhabitants possessed knowledge of the landscape that humbled Fawcett. They could read signs in the forest that he could barely perceive. They knew which plants were edible, which held medicine, which brought death. They navigated without compasses or maps, using landmarks, star positions, and an accumulated geographic knowledge passed through generations. Fawcett recognized that despite his instruments and training, he was blind compared to people who had lived their entire lives in this environment. The forest tested every aspect of human endurance. Infections were constant. Cuts and scratches, unavoidable when pushing through vegetation, became infected within hours in the hot, humid conditions. Without antibiotics, which didn't exist yet, these infections could spread, turning minor wounds into serious threats. Fawcett and his men learned to treat wounds immediately, cleaning them as best they could with limited supplies. Insects were perhaps the worst daily torment. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, biting relentlessly. But mosquitoes were merely annoying compared to other threats. Botflies laid eggs on mosquitoes, which then transferred to human skin. The larvae burrowed in, creating painful swellings that had to be extracted. Jiggers, tiny fleas, burrowed under toenails and into the soft skin of feet, where they had to be dug out. Ticks latched on, swelling with blood. Ants of various species inflicted bites ranging from merely painful to excruciating. The water itself carried dangers. Rivers hosted piranhas, though these fish were generally less dangerous than reputation suggested, only becoming truly aggressive in certain conditions. Caimans, relatives of alligators, lurked in quiet waters. Electric eels could deliver stunning shocks. Stingrays rested on river bottoms, their barbed tails capable of inflicting terrible wounds. Parasites existed that could enter the body through any orifice, some causing conditions so unpleasant that expedition members learned never to urinate while in the water. Snakes were surprisingly rare encounters for Fawcett. The forest held deadly species, certainly. Bushmasters, the largest pit vipers in the world, could deliver enough venom to kill a human. Fer-de-lances, shorter but equally venomous, were more common. Anacondas, massive constrictors, inhabited swamps and slow rivers. But the forest was so vast and these creatures so well camouflaged that one could walk for days without seeing a dangerous snake. Still, the possibility created constant vigilance. Every log stepped over, every reach into vegetation, carried the awareness that something deadly might be there. The psychological weight of the Amazon impressed itself upon Fawcett and his men. The forest seemed infinite. No matter how far they traveled, it continued unchanged in every direction. The lack of distant views created a claustrophobic feeling despite the open space beneath the canopy. One could be completely lost 20 meters from camp. The forest provided no landmarks, just endless trees. The continuous green became oppressive after weeks and months. Some men broke under this strain, becoming obsessed with escaping the jungle, willing to abandon the expedition if it meant returning to open country. Yet Fawcett himself seemed energized by the challenge. His journals reveal a man fascinated by every aspect of the landscape. He noted the different tree species, though he lacked training to identify most of them. He observed animal behavior, from the methodical path of leafcutter ants carrying their burdens to the sudden frenzy of a feeding school of piranhas. He recorded weather patterns, noting how afternoon storms arrived with predictable regularity, preceded by a building heaviness in the air and a stilling of the forest sounds. The 1906 to 1907 survey expedition lasted for months. Fawcett's team traveled hundreds of kilometers, much of it through territory where they were certainly the first Europeans, possibly the first humans from outside local indigenous groups, to ever pass. They mapped rivers, established positions, and collected data that would resolve boundary disputes. But more than that, Fawcett began to develop a relationship with the Amazon, an understanding that this landscape was not merely an obstacle to overcome but a complex, functioning system worth knowing on its own terms. When Fawcett finally emerged from the jungle and returned to civilization, he found himself already planning his return. The first expedition had been successful in its objectives. The Bolivian and Brazilian governments were satisfied with his work. But Fawcett had caught a glimpse of something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had seen territory that made him wonder what else remained hidden in the Amazon's vastness. He had heard indigenous stories of ancient ruins, lost cities, civilizations that had vanished into the forest. And he had felt the Amazon's power, its terrible beauty, its absolute indifference to human ambition. The Amazon rainforest functions as a vertical world, a layered cake of distinct habitats stacked from the ground to heights that would impress a modern building. Understanding these layers helps explain why the forest supports such staggering biodiversity and why traveling through it presents unique challenges. The forest floor, the lowest level, receives as little as 1% of the sunlight that strikes the canopy above. This perpetual twilight creates conditions unlike anywhere else on Earth. The air is still, barely moved by wind. The temperature remains constant, hot but not as extreme as the sun-baked areas outside the forest. Humidity hovers near saturation. Everything feels damp to the touch. Fungi thrive in these conditions, erupting from fallen logs in bizarre shapes and colors. Leaf litter covers the ground, sometimes ankle-deep. This constant rain of dead leaves, twigs, and branches provides the raw material for the forest's recycling system. An army of decomposers, from bacteria and fungi to insects and earthworms, breaks down this organic matter, releasing nutrients that tree roots quickly absorb. In tropical rainforests, decomposition happens so rapidly that nutrients rarely accumulate in the soil. Instead, they remain locked in the living biomass of the forest itself. Despite the dimness, life flourishes at ground level. Small palms and broadleaf plants adapted to low light conditions form scattered undergrowth. Seedlings of canopy trees wait patiently, sometimes for decades, for a gap to open above that will allow them to race upward. Ferns unfurl fronds in shaded spots. Termite mounds, built from soil particles glued together with saliva and feces, rise like miniature cathedrals, housing colonies millions strong. The forest floor is also where the largest land animals walk. Tapirs, pig-like mammals with prehensile snouts, browse on fallen fruits and low vegetation. Peccaries, relatives of pigs, travel in noisy herds, rooting in the leaf litter for food. Jaguars, the apex predators of the Amazon, pad silently through their territories, their spotted coats disappearing into the dappled shadows. Fawcett occasionally saw these animals, though more often he found their tracks in mud or heard them moving through the vegetation. Above the forest floor rises the understory, the zone from roughly 2 to 15 meters height. This layer sees slightly more light, perhaps 2 to 5% of full sun, filtered through multiple leaf layers above. Here the competition for any available light becomes fierce. Plants develop enormous leaves to capture every photon. Shrubs and small trees fill available space. Vines drape from above or climb upward, using trees as scaffolding to reach toward brighter conditions. The understory is where humans actually travel when walking through the Amazon. It's also where the worst tangles of vegetation occur, particularly in areas where past disturbances allowed light to penetrate and stimulate dense growth. Fawcett and his men spent days hacking through such tangles with machetes, advancing mere meters per hour, exhausting themselves in the stifling heat. Many of the Amazon's most spectacular plants live in the understory. Heliconia species, relatives of bananas, produce brilliant red, orange, or yellow bracts that attract hummingbirds. Various species of palms fill this zone, some with trunks covered in spine-like projections that could shred skin. Arums, related to house plants familiar to gardeners, produce massive leaves and unusual flowers. Some plants in this layer develop relationships with ants, providing hollows in their stems where ant colonies nest, while the ants defend the plant from herbivores and even clear competing vegetation from around their host. The midstory, from about 15 to 30 meters, forms a transitional zone between the darkness below and the sunlit canopy above. Trees at this height are fighting upward, most of them younger individuals that haven't yet reached their full potential. Their crowns remain relatively small, their leaves arranged to capture light filtering from above. Epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants without being parasitic, begin to appear in significant numbers in this layer. Bromeliads, relatives of pineapples, catch water in rosettes of leaves, creating miniature ponds that host their own communities of insects, frogs, and other small creatures. Then comes the canopy, the leafy ceiling that defines the rainforest. This zone, roughly 30 to 40 meters above the ground, receives abundant sunlight and hosts the majority of the forest's life. Trees here spread their crowns wide, each trying to shade competitors while maximizing its own light capture. During the day, the canopy simmers with activity. Monkeys travel through branches with confident leaps. Sloths, moving slowly as their name suggests, navigate from tree to tree. Countless species of insects, birds, reptiles, and small mammals make their entire lives here, never descending to the ground. The canopy creates its own climate. Up in the leaves, temperatures fluctuate more than below. When the sun beats down, surfaces can become quite hot. At night, some cooling occurs. Humidity remains high but less oppressive than the saturated air beneath. Wind reaches the canopy, rustling leaves, and carrying seeds. Rain arrives here first, each drop starting a journey through the layers below, some water absorbed by leaves and bark, some captured in the cups and hollows of epiphytes, the remainder eventually reaching the ground. Flowering and fruiting happens primarily in the canopy. Trees produce flowers designed to attract specific pollinators, from insects to bats to birds. The timing is often precise. Some trees flower all at once in a spectacular display. Others stagger their flowering throughout the year. Fruits develop in staggering variety. Some trees produce enormous seed pods. Others make tiny fruits by the thousands. Each has evolved to attract particular dispersers that will carry seeds to new locations, whether it's monkeys, birds, bats, or even fish that swim through flooded forests and eat fruits that drop into the water. Above the canopy, a final layer exists. These are the emergent trees, giants that break through the canopy roof to stand 50, 60, or even 70 meters tall. Emergent trees must be incredibly strong to withstand the full force of wind and weather without the shelter of neighboring trees. They develop massive buttress roots, flanges of wood that extend from the trunk and provide stability against toppling. Their crowns, while tall, are often surprisingly small and compact. From an airplane, the canopy below looks like a lumpy green blanket, and emergent trees poke through like ships in a vegetable sea. These trees serve as landmarks for animals. Large birds use them as perches and nesting sites. Harpy eagles, among the world's most powerful raptors, build stick nests in emergent trees and hunt monkeys and sloths from these vantage points. Fawcett, traveling below, could only imagine what the canopy held. Modern scientists use cranes, towers, and even inflatable platforms to study the canopy ecosystem, but in Fawcett's era, the treetops remained as inaccessible as another world. Occasionally, a tree would fall, crashing down through the layers below in an explosion of destruction that opened a temporary window to the sky. These gaps allowed ground-level glimpses of the canopy's bounty, fruits, and flowers lying among the broken branches. The vertical structure of the rainforest creates acoustic effects. Sounds behave strangely in this layered environment. The howls of monkeys carry for kilometers, modified by reflection and absorption as they pass through the forest. Bird calls, especially those of birds living in the understory, tend to be lower pitched and less musical than the songs of canopy species. Sound travels differently through the dense vegetation, becoming muffled, losing its directionality. Fawcett noted that it was often impossible to tell how far away a sound originated or even which direction it came from. A bird calling from 20 meters might sound distant, while a jaguar coughing 100 meters away might seem alarmingly close. Light creates the forest structure, but water sustains it. The Amazon experiences no true dry season in the sense of extended rainless periods, though rainfall does vary seasonally. Some months bring daily torrential downpours. Other months see rain only every few days. But moisture never truly leaves. The forest remains hydrated, the rivers continue flowing, and the trees keep transpiring, sending water vapor skyward to form tomorrow's clouds. The interaction between light and the forest's layers creates a dimming effect that affects every aspect of life. Seeds falling to the forest floor must wait for a light gap to grow. Animals adapt to the low light with large eyes or heightened senses of hearing and smell. The deeper into the forest Fawcett traveled, the more he understood that he was moving through a world humans weren't designed for, a realm where our visual orientation and open country evolution left us at a disadvantage. Yet the forest was never silent, never still. Even in the darkest midday shadows, life pulsed. Insects crawled up bark, seeking crevices to hide in or eggs to lay. Birds worked through the understory vegetation, plucking fruits and insects. Small frogs no larger than a fingernail called from hiding places among fallen leaves, each species with its own distinct note. The forest floor rustled continuously with small movements, most of which Fawcett never identified despite his curiosity. Water defines the Amazon as much as trees. The Amazon River and its countless tributaries create a liquid network that shapes every aspect of the landscape. Understanding these waterways is essential to understanding Percy Fawcett's journeys, because rivers served as his highways, his challenges, and often his only means of navigation through the otherwise trackless forest. The Amazon River itself begins in the Andes Mountains of southern Peru, though pinpointing the exact source has been a matter of debate. Multiple streams high in the mountains could claim to be the origin. These cold, clear mountain brooks tumble down slopes, gathering volume as they merge. By the time the young river reaches the lowlands, it has already become substantial. The Amazon flows east across the continent, a journey of approximately 6,400 kilometers before emptying into the Atlantic Ocean. Along this path, the river collects water from a basin that sprawls across 40% of South America. More than 1,000 major tributaries feed it, some of them massive rivers in their own right. The Negro, the Madeira, the Tapajos, the Zinga, these rivers would rank among the world's largest if measured independently, yet they're merely branches of the greater Amazon system. The volume of water flowing through the Amazon defies easy comprehension. At its mouth, the river discharges about 200,000 cubic meters of water every single second. That's enough to fill multiple Olympic swimming pools every second. In fact, the Amazon carries more water than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. This immense flow creates a plume of fresh water that extends hundreds of kilometers into the Atlantic, pushing back the ocean, creating a zone where sailors can drink fresh water while still out of sight of land. During the flood season, water levels along the Amazon's main channel can rise 10 to 15 meters above dry season levels. This annual pulse affects everything. Forests along the river spend months underwater. Fish populations shift, with many species timing their breeding to coincide with floods. Indigenous peoples adjust their settlements, moving to higher ground or building homes on stilts that tower above the expected high-water mark. Fawcett traveled primarily on tributaries rather than the main Amazon channel. His surveying work took him up rivers that ranged from substantial flows to streams barely wide enough for his boat. Each river presented its own character, shaped by the land it drained and the geology it flowed across. Whitewater rivers, carrying sediment from the Andes, run the color of Café Au late. Standing on the bank, you cannot see more than a few centimeters beneath the surface. The water is opaque, thick with suspended particles of clay and silt. Despite this cloudiness, whitewater rivers are rich in nutrients and support abundant fish populations. The annual floods deposit sediment on floodplains, creating fertile varzea forests. These whitewater rivers move with impressive force. Even in apparently calm sections, the current runs strong, carrying small floating debris along at a steady pace. Going upstream against this current required tremendous effort. Fawcett's boats, powered by men with poles and paddles or by small outboard motors when available, crept upriver meter by meter. A day of exhausting labor might advance them only a few kilometers. When motors failed or rapids became too severe, the only option was to unload the boat, lighten it as much as possible, and haul it forward with ropes while wading through shallows or walking along the bank. Black water rivers create entirely different conditions. The Rio Negro, largest of the black water tributaries, flows from the north to join the Amazon near the modern city of Manaus. For several kilometers downstream of this confluence, the black water and the tan white water flow side by side without mixing, creating a striking visual boundary between the two flow patterns. Black water forms when rain percolates through forests growing on sandy, nutrient-poor soils. Decaying leaves release tannins and other organic compounds that stain the water dark brown, like strong tea. The acidity of black water rivers can approach that of vinegar. Despite this, many fish species thrive in these conditions, adapted to the unique chemistry. The black water reflects the sky perfectly on calm days, creating surreal landscapes where trees seem to float in mirror images, and clouds drift below as well as above. Black water rivers move more slowly than white water rivers, generally. They meander extensively, looping back on themselves in oxbow curves that can confuse navigation. What appears on a map as 20 kilometers of river might actually require 40 or 50 kilometers of travel when following the winding course. Fawcett learned to spot places where rivers were cutting new channels, where floodwaters had created shortcuts across the narrow necks of meanders, potentially providing easier passage. Clear water rivers are less common but spectacular. The Tapajos River, flowing from the Brazilian Shield in the south, runs green-blue and transparent. In shallow areas, you can see the sandy bottom meters below the surface. These rivers flow through rocky terrain where sediment settles quickly. The water chemistry sits between white water and black water rivers, supporting unique ecosystems. The seasonal flooding cycle creates some of the Amazon's most distinctive forest types. Várzea forests grow along white water rivers. During the dry season, these forests stand on dry ground, but when floods arrive, water rises through the trees, sometimes reaching heights of 10 meters or more above the forest floor. Fish swim through the forest, feeding on fruits and seeds that fall from trees. Some species of fish have evolved to be seed dispersers, eating fruits whole and excreting the seeds later in different locations. Trees in Várzea forests must tolerate having their roots submerged for months. Many develop specialized root adaptations. Some can absorb oxygen through lenticels, special openings in the bark. Others have developed seeds that float and can germinate while drifting, establishing themselves wherever they eventually wash ashore. The trees typically grow faster and taller than their terra firma counterparts, benefiting from the annual deposit of nutrient-rich sediment. Igapo forests grow in areas flooded by black water rivers. The water is less nutrient-rich, and the flooding can last longer, sometimes 6 months or more each year. Trees here tend to be shorter and less diverse than in Várzea forests. The acidic water creates challenging conditions. Yet life persists. Certain fish species specialize in Igapo forests. Some birds time their nesting to occur during the flooded season, building nests low in the branches, just above the water's surface. Navigating flooded forests presented unique challenges for Fawcett. Passages that existed during the dry season disappeared underwater. New routes opened as boats could travel over what had been dry land. But these apparent shortcuts came with dangers. Submerged logs and stumps could hole a boat. Dense vegetation beneath the surface could tangle propellers or poles. And finding your way through a flooded forest, where every tree looked similar and usual landmarks were submerged, required careful attention and frequent position checks. Rapids and waterfalls created serious obstacles on many rivers. Where rivers dropped over ledges or flowed through constricted channels filled with boulders, the water accelerated and churned into white foam. The roar of rapids could be heard from considerable distances, echoing through the forest, giving advance warning of the challenges ahead. Navigating rapids required skill and sometimes sheer courage. The safest route often wasn't obvious from upstream. Fawcett would land before a rapid and scout it on foot, looking for a channel deep enough to carry the boat but not so violent as to capsize or smash it against rocks. Sometimes a viable route existed. Other times, the only option was portage, the back-breaking work of unloading everything, carrying supplies overland, and either dragging the boat across land or floating it empty through the rapid while controlling it with ropes from the shore. Some rapids were simply impassable. The water dropped too steeply, or the rocks were too numerous, or the channel too narrow. These natural barriers marked the end of navigable sections. Beyond them, Continuing upriver meant abandoning boats and proceeding on foot, a transition that dramatically increased difficulty. A boat, however crude, could carry supplies and equipment. On foot, every item had to be carried on someone's back. Waterfalls presented absolute barriers to boat travel but also spectacular sights. Some of the Amazon's tributaries cascade over escarpments in falls that would be world famous if located in more accessible regions. Fawcett encountered numerous waterfalls during his expeditions, some dropping 30 or 50 meters in single plunges, others descending in staircases of falls and pools. The mist, the thunder of falling water, and the rainbows that formed in the spray created scenes of overwhelming beauty, though Fawcett's practical mind usually focused more on the challenge of getting past them. The rivers also harbored life that ranged from fascinating to dangerous. Pink river dolphins, unique to the Amazon system, surfaced to breathe, their curved backs breaking the water's surface. These dolphins differed from ocean species, having flexible necks, smaller eyes, and the ability to navigate through flooded forests. Indigenous peoples held various beliefs about these dolphins, some seeing them as transformed humans, others as spirits. Caimans, the American relatives of alligators, basked on riverbanks during the day and hunted at night. While smaller than saltwater crocodiles, the black caiman could reach impressive sizes, large enough to be genuinely dangerous to humans. Fawcett and his men learned to be cautious when wading in rivers, checking for these reptiles before stepping into the water. Piranhas gained fearsome reputations, much of it exaggerated but based on real dangers. These fish, with their sharp, triangular teeth and powerful jaws, primarily scavenged and ate other fish. But in certain conditions, particularly when trapped in shrinking pools during the dry season, they could become aggressive. A large school of piranhas could strip a carcass to bones in minutes. Fawcett witnessed this several times, though he noted that healthy humans swimming in normal conditions had little to fear. The key was avoiding swimming when injured, as blood in the water could trigger feeding frenzies. Electric eels, despite their name, are not actually eels but a type of knife fish. They can generate powerful electric shocks, up to 600 volts, used for hunting and self-defense. Stepping on an electric eel hidden in muddy shallows could deliver a shock strong enough to stun a human, potentially causing drowning if it happened in deep water. The local guides Fawcett hired knew to probe ahead with sticks when wading through murky water, giving any hidden eels a chance to move away. Stingrays, flat fish related to sharks, rested on river bottoms buried in sand or mud. Their tails bore venomous barbs that could inflict excruciating wounds. The pain from a stingray barb has been described as one of the worst pains humans can experience. Wounds often became infected, and the venom could cause serious systemic effects. Like electric eels, stingrays could be avoided by shuffling feet rather than stepping, giving them warning to flee rather than strike. The rivers themselves could kill through drowning. The currents were powerful. The water often ran deep. If someone fell overboard, particularly in rapids, rescue was not guaranteed. Fawcett lost men to rivers during his expeditions. Some fell into rapids and were carried away despite rescue attempts. Others simply disappeared, perhaps taken by caimans, perhaps drowning in unexpected deep water or becoming tangled in submerged vegetation. Yet the rivers also provided the only practical means of travel through much of the Amazon. The forest, for all its magnificence, was nearly impassable when traveling cross-country. Distances that might take a day on the river could require a week on foot, hacking through undergrowth, crossing countless small streams, climbing over fallen logs, and enduring the forest's full intensity without the relief of river breezes. Fawcett developed profound respect for the Amazon's rivers. They were roads and obstacles simultaneously, sources of food and danger in equal measure. Learning to read a river, to understand its moods and patterns, became essential survival skills. The color and texture of the water told stories about what lay upstream. The sound of the current revealed hidden obstacles. The behavior of fish and birds indicated weather conditions were normal or disturbed. In 1909, Percy Fawcett returned to the Amazon. His first expedition had been successful enough that he received new commissions, more boundaries to survey, more blank spaces on maps to fill with accurate information. This time his assignment took him to the Heath River, a tributary marking part of the border between Bolivia and Peru, and deeper into the Madre de Dios region of southeastern Peru. The 1909 expedition would test Fawcett in ways the earlier journey had not. He would travel through territory even more remote, encounter indigenous groups with whom contact was dangerous, and face landscape challenges that pushed his endurance to its limits. But he would also see things that fired his imagination and planted seeds of ideas that would eventually consume him. The journey began, as most Amazon expeditions did, on rivers. Fawcett's team traveled up the Madre de Dios River, a substantial waterway that drains the eastern slopes of the Andes in Peru. The Madre de Dios runs fast and cold, carrying meltwater and rainfall from high elevations. During the journey upriver, the landscape began to change subtly. The terrain became more varied, with hills appearing where before the land had been relatively flat. The forest remained thick, but the tree species shifted, and the understory grew denser. Gold prospectors had begun working some parts of the Madre de Dios region. Fawcett encountered their camps, rough settlements where men lived in brutal conditions, panning for gold in the riverbed or digging into banks where placer deposits accumulated. These prospectors told stories of the interior, tales that mixed fact and fantasy in proportions difficult to determine. They spoke of dense forests where travel was nearly impossible, of indigenous groups who attacked outsiders on sight, and of strange ruins glimpsed through the trees. The Heath River junction marked a transition point. The river itself was smaller than the Madre de Dios, but the territory it drained was the focus of Fawcett's survey. Following the Heath meant entering regions where few outsiders had traveled. The riverbanks showed no signs of human presence beyond occasional indigenous trails leading back into the forest. The isolation was profound. As the expedition advanced, the landscape revealed patterns. The forest was not monotonous but varied in response to subtle environmental changes. Areas that flooded regularly supported different tree communities than higher ground. Rocky outcrops, where they appeared, hosted plants adapted to thinner soils. The river itself changed character frequently, alternating between lazy meanders through lowlands and faster sections where it cut through higher terrain. Fawcett's surveying work required precision under difficult conditions. To establish accurate positions, he needed clear views of the sky at specific times to take astronomical observations. This meant finding appropriate locations, often requiring detours from the river to reach elevated points or natural clearings. Each position fix involved careful calculations, using tables and a chronometer to convert angle measurements into coordinates. Mistakes would compound over distance, creating errors that would render the entire survey worthless. The work proceeded slowly. Days passed with minimal progress as the team fought the river's current, portaged around obstacles, and stopped frequently for Fawcett to conduct observations. The heat remained relentless. Supplies began to run low. Game animals, which could supplement their provisions, proved surprisingly difficult to hunt in the dense forest. Birds were abundant but small. Larger animals, tapirs and peccaries, were present but wary, usually detecting the expedition's approach and melting away into the vegetation before anyone could get a clear shot. The indigenous peoples of this region belonged to various groups, each with distinct languages, customs, and territories. Some groups had experienced contact with outsiders, usually traumatic encounters with rubber tappers or slave raiders. These groups understandably viewed any visitors with suspicion or outright hostility. Other groups had minimal or no contact with non-indigenous peoples and approached the expedition with curiosity mixed with caution. Fawcett's policy of peaceful approach was tested repeatedly. Arrows would suddenly appear, thudding into trees near the expedition's camp or whistling past boats on the river. The expedition would halt, make themselves visible, hold up gifts, and wait. Sometimes indigenous warriors would emerge from the forest, armed but willing to talk through gestures and fragments of shared vocabulary. Other times the hidden archers simply disappeared, leaving the expedition to wonder whether proceeding forward meant walking into an ambush. The landscape itself communicated information about human presence. Fawcett learned to recognize signs that indigenous peoples left on the land. Trails, often almost invisible to untrained eyes, showed as slight clearings in undergrowth or arrangements of bent vegetation. Camps left evidence in the form of fire-cracked rocks, discarded tool materials, and areas where forest composition changed because useful plants had been encouraged while others were removed. Even patterns in the forest canopy could indicate old settlements, where fast-growing species had filled gaps created decades or centuries earlier when larger trees were cut for construction or agriculture. The terra preta, or black earth, caught Fawcett's attention. In some locations, the soil changed from the typical reddish clay to dark, rich earth that seemed startlingly fertile compared to surrounding areas. These patches of black soil occurred too frequently and consistently to be natural anomalies. Fawcett suspected, correctly as later research would prove, that indigenous peoples had created this enriched soil through long-term management, adding charcoal, organic waste, and possibly other amendments over generations. The presence of terra preta suggested that areas now covered in what appeared to be pristine forest had once supported substantial settlements. This observation conflicted with prevailing ideas about the Amazon. European scientists and explorers generally assumed the forest was too poor in resources to support large populations. The thin, nutrient-depleted soil seemed incapable of sustaining agriculture. Therefore, the thinking went, indigenous populations must have always been small and scattered, living as simple hunter-gatherers. But the terra preta, along with indigenous oral histories and the scale of earthworks beginning to be documented in some regions, hinted at a different past. Perhaps the Amazon had once supported much larger populations, complex societies that had collapsed after European diseases swept through in the wake of early colonial contact. The forest sometimes opened into natural savannas, patches of grassland that interrupted the endless trees. These savannas developed where soil conditions or drainage prevented forest establishment, or where natural fires periodically cleared woody vegetation. The transition from forest to savanna could be abrupt, stepping from beneath the canopy into open grassland within a few meters. These clearings provided relief from the forest's oppressive enclosure. The sky opened above, visible from horizon to horizon. Breezes moved freely, drying sweat and cooling skin. The visual contrast was striking, the expanse of grass and scattered shrubs replacing the vertical walls of tree trunks. But savannas presented their own challenges. During the dry season, the grass could grow tall enough to hide dangers. Walking through chest-high grass meant limited visibility and the constant possibility of stepping on snakes. During the wet season, savannas often flooded, becoming vast shallow lakes that stretched to the horizon. Crossing these flooded grasslands required either extensive detours to find higher ground or wading through water of uncertain depth, testing each step for holes or soft mud that could trap unwary travelers. The expedition encountered swamps, transitional zones where water dominated the landscape. Some swamps were permanently wet, supporting specialized vegetation adapted to saturated soils and standing water. Trees in these swamps developed prop roots or pneumatophores, specialized structures that helped them obtain oxygen in waterlogged conditions. Walking through swamps was exhausting. Each step sank into mud, and extracting one's foot required effort that quickly drained energy. Water depth varied unpredictably. A step might land on firm ground hidden just beneath the surface, or it might plunge through several feet of water into bottomless-feeling mud. Swamps were paradoxically beautiful and hellish. Brilliant green algae and floating plants covered water surfaces. Unusual flowers bloomed on aquatic plants. Birds fed in the shallows, their calls echoing across the open water. But the physical challenge of crossing swamps, combined with concentrated populations of biting insects that thrived in these environments, made them among the most difficult terrains to navigate. The Heath River expedition pushed Fawcett's endurance. Weeks extended into months. The rainy season arrived, adding to the difficulty. Daily storms turned the river into a raging torrent and transformed the forest into a dripping, sodden environment where nothing ever dried. Clothes rotted. Leather goods grew mold. Paper became damp and fragile. The expedition's supplies dwindled. They were deep in territory where resupply was impossible. Hunger became a constant companion. The psychological strain affected everyone. The forest's sameness created a sense of moving without progress, as though they walked on an enormous treadmill where the scenery never changed despite endless effort. Team members began to show signs of breaking. One man became convinced they were traveling in circles and that Fawcett was lost despite evidence to the contrary. Another developed a fever and had to be carried, adding to the burden on the others. Yet Fawcett persisted. His journals from this period show a man driven by something beyond the immediate task. He was genuinely fascinated by the landscape and by the challenge it presented. He wrote detailed observations about everything he saw, from the behavior of army ant columns that flowed across the forest floor like rivers of insects, to the architecture of indigenous shelters they occasionally encountered, to his own physical and mental states as the expedition tested his limits. The return journey, descending the rivers with the current, went faster but carried its own dangers. Rapids that they had laboriously portaged around while ascending now had to be run. This meant carefully positioning the boat, committing to a route through the churning water, and hoping the channel was deep enough and the rocks were avoided. Several times they nearly capsized. Once, the boat struck a submerged log and took on water, forcing an emergency landing to bail out and repair damage. When Fawcett finally emerged from the Amazon after the 1909 expedition, he had completed the survey objectives. The Heath River boundary was accurately mapped. His data would be used to resolve disputes between Bolivia and Peru. But more importantly for Fawcett's future, he had seen deeper into the Amazon than before. He had traveled through landscapes that seemed to suggest past civilizations. He had heard more stories from indigenous peoples about ancient cities and lost kingdoms. And he had developed a theory, still inchoate but growing stronger, that the Amazon held secrets that contradicted everything European science believed about the region. The Amazon's apparent uniformity masks incredible diversity. Within what looks like endless jungle exist thousands of distinct forest types, each responding to subtle variations in soil, water, elevation, and disturbance history. Understanding this diversity helps explain both the Amazon's ecological richness and the challenges it presented to explorers like Fawcett. Terra firma forest, the upland forest that never floods, represents what most people imagine when they think of rainforest. These forests grow on the oldest, most weathered soils in the Amazon basin. The soil itself is typically acidic, leached of nutrients by millions of years of rainfall. Most minerals have long since been washed away, leaving behind iron and aluminum oxides that give the soil its characteristic red color. On paper, this soil should be incapable of supporting lush forest. Yet the terra firma hosts some of the tallest trees and the highest biodiversity in the Amazon. The secret lies in the efficiency of nutrient cycling. In temperate forests, nutrients accumulate in soil organic matter, building rich humus layers over time. In the Amazon's terra firma, decomposition happens so rapidly that nutrients barely touch the soil before being reabsorbed by living roots. Fungi play a crucial role, forming mycorrhizal associations with tree roots that vastly extend their absorptive surface area. Some studies have shown that if you add radioactively tagged nutrients to terra firma forest, they appear in tree leaves within days, evidence of the incredibly tight cycling that prevents nutrient loss. Trees in terra firma develop extensive root systems, though often surprisingly shallow. Many Amazonian trees have roots concentrated in the top meter of soil, where leaf litter decomposes and nutrients become available. The massive buttress roots that many species develop serve multiple functions. They provide stability for tall trees in shallow soils. They may help with water uptake by increasing surface area. And they create microhabitats, spaces between the flanges where leaf litter accumulates and where small animals find shelter. The species diversity of terra firma forests staggers the mind. In a single hectare, researchers have documented over 300 species of trees. That's more tree species in 2.5 acres than exist in all of North America. This diversity extends to every level of biological organization. Thousands of insect species, hundreds of bird species, dozens of mammal species, all coexisting in complex webs of interaction. Why such diversity exists has been debated for decades. Part of the answer probably lies in the Amazon stability. While climate has fluctuated over geological time, the Amazon has maintained forested conditions for millions of years, allowing species to accumulate without the wholesale extinctions that glacial periods caused at higher latitudes. Part of the answer involves the complexity of the habitat itself, which creates countless niche opportunities. And part involves the intricate specialization that has evolved, with many species becoming extremely specific in their requirements, allowing more species to pack into the same space. For Fawcett, this diversity meant constant novelty but also difficulty. The forest lacked the easily recognizable landmarks that help with navigation. Tree species changed constantly, often subtly. One massive trunk looked much like another unless you were a trained botanist who could identify species by bark patterns or leaf shapes. This created a disorienting environment where getting lost was easy and finding one's way back challenging. Varzea forest, growing along whitewater rivers, contrasts with terra firma in significant ways. The annual flood pulse dominates everything in Varzea. Trees must tolerate months of inundation. Many Varzea species shed their leaves during the flood season, entering a dormant state while underwater, then leafing out rapidly when water recedes. Others maintain leaves year-round but have adaptations to survive submersion, including the ability to absorb oxygen through specialized bark tissues. Varzea forests tend to be less diverse than terra firma but more productive. The annual sediment deposits bring nutrients from the Andes, fertilizing the floodplain. Trees grow faster and larger than in terra firma. Some Varzea species can grow several centimeters in diameter per year, compared to millimeters for terra firma species. This rapid growth creates dense wood that resists rot even in the waterlogged conditions. The fauna of Varzea forests include species specially adapted to the flood cycle. Many fish species migrate into the flooded forest to spawn and feed. They consume fruits and seeds from Varzea trees, and some have evolved teeth and jaw structures specifically for cracking hard seed cases. When floods recede and fish return to the main river channels, they carry seeds in their guts, depositing them in new locations and providing an unusual form of seed dispersal. Fawcett traveled through Varzea forests during different seasons, experiencing both the flooded and dry phases. During floods, navigation became surreal. His boat would travel through the forest, weaving between tree trunks, occasionally having to backtrack when the passage ahead became too narrow or blocked by vegetation. Fish jumped around the boat. Birds and monkeys moved through the canopy above, appearing unconcerned by the transformed landscape below. During the dry season, Varzea revealed a different character. The exposed floodplain, covered with fresh sediment, quickly sprouted new growth. Fast-growing herbaceous plants colonized the bare ground. Seeds that had been dormant underwater germinated. Within weeks, what had been barren mud transformed into dense vegetation. This rapid growth attracted animals. Capybaras, the world's largest rodents, grazed on new shoots. Caimans hunted in the shrinking pools where fish became concentrated. Igapo forests, associated with black water rivers, presented yet another variant. The acidic, nutrient-poor water and extended flooding created harsh conditions. Igapo forests are less productive than Varzea, with slower-growing trees and lower overall biomass. But they develop unique characteristics. The dark water creates stunning visual effects, mirror-like reflections that double the forest, making it difficult to judge distances or even distinguish up from down when the surface is perfectly calm. Trees in Igapo adapt to the challenging conditions with various strategies. Some species have seeds that can remain viable for months while floating, waiting for appropriate conditions to germinate. Others reproduce vegetatively, with branches that touch the water rooting and forming new individuals. The extended flooding favors trees that can photosynthesize even with their roots submerged, species that maintain leaves and continue growing even when half their structure is underwater. Seasonally dry forests occur in parts of the southern Amazon where rainfall becomes more strongly seasonal. These forests experience a pronounced dry period lasting several months each year. In response, many trees shed their leaves, entering dormancy to conserve water. The forest takes on a different appearance during the dry season, more open, with light reaching the ground, and with a carpet of dead leaves crackling underfoot rather than the damp, slowly decomposing litter of evergreen forests. The transition between wet and dry seasons in these forests is dramatic. As the first rains arrive after the dry period, trees leaf out rapidly. Within days, the forest canopy transforms from bare branches to full leaf cover. Flowers emerge, often appearing on leafless branches before the leaves develop, creating spectacular flowering displays that attract pollinators from miles around. The forest awakens after its dormant period, resuming growth with explosive energy. Bamboo forests occur in patches throughout the Amazon, vast areas dominated by woody bamboo species that can grow to considerable heights. These bamboos create unusually uniform forest structure, with dense stands of similar-aged stems rising in parallel. The ground beneath bamboo forests is typically clear of undergrowth, shaded by the dense bamboo canopy. Walking through mature bamboo is relatively easy compared to navigating typical rainforest, though young bamboo shoots can create impenetrable tangles. Bamboos exhibit peculiar life cycles. Many species grow vegetatively for decades, slowly expanding their stands through underground rhizomes. Then, synchronously, all the bamboos in a population will flower, produce seeds, and die. This mass flowering and death creates openings in the forest and releases enormous quantities of bamboo seeds, which can trigger population explosions of rodents and other seed-eating animals. Indigenous peoples sometimes timed their movements and activities around bamboo flowering events, knowing the associated changes in animal populations. Fawcett encountered bamboo forests during his expeditions and noted their unusual characteristics. The relative ease of movement through them was welcome relief after struggling through denser forest. But bamboo forests also presented challenges. The uniform structure made navigation more difficult, lacking the varied landmarks that helped with orientation. And during dieback phases after flowering, the landscape became a chaotic tangle of dead, fallen culms that blocked passage and created hazards. Palm swamps occur where drainage is poor and water accumulates. Dominated by various palm species adapted to waterlogged conditions, these swamps create challenging terrain. The palms often grow in dense stands, their spiny trunks close together, making movement difficult. The water between palm trunks can be deep, and the bottom is usually soft mud rather than firm ground. Crossing palm swamps required careful probing ahead, testing depth and substrate, often taking long detours to find passable routes. Gallery forests line smaller streams and rivers, creating corridors of taller, denser forest through areas that might otherwise be savanna or scrubland. These forests depend on the water availability provided by the nearby stream. They create important wildlife corridors, allowing forest species to move through otherwise inhospitable landscapes. The vegetation in gallery forests is often particularly dense, with trees, shrubs, and vines all competing for space along the water's edge. The landscape's constant variation meant Fawcett never knew precisely what to expect. A day's journey might take him from terra firma forest to flooded Varzea, across a savanna clearing, through a palm swamp, and into a bamboo forest, each transition requiring different strategies and presenting different challenges. This heterogeneity made the Amazon simultaneously fascinating and exhausting, a landscape that demanded constant adaptation and attention. Understanding the forest types helped Fawcett make decisions about routes and camps. Terra firma provided the most reliable camping locations, with firm ground and access to game animals. Varzea offered good camping during the dry season but had to be avoided during floods. Bamboo forests, while easy to walk through, lacked the diversity of food sources found in other forest types. Each landscape type had advantages and disadvantages that affected expedition planning. The forest also changed with elevation, though the Amazon is predominantly lowland. Still, variations of a few dozen meters could create noticeable transitions. Low-lying areas prone to flooding supported one set of species. Slightly elevated areas that flooded only in extreme years supported different communities. The highest ground, which never flooded, hosted the most diverse terra firma forests. These elevational differences were often subtle, visible only in vegetation changes rather than obvious topographic features, requiring careful observation to detect and utilize for navigation. Cloud cover frequently obscured the sky, making celestial navigation impossible for days at a stretch. When observations were possible, Fawcett had to work quickly, before weather closed in again. He became skilled at finding openings in the canopy or reaching elevated points where views of the horizon improved. Each successful observation represented a small victory, another data point that made the map more accurate. The maps themselves were works of art and science combined. Fawcett drafted them carefully, noting rivers, tributaries, vegetation types, indigenous settlements, topographic features, and anything else that might be useful to future travelers. These maps represented genuine contributions to geographical knowledge, filling blank spaces with accurate information derived from direct observation and careful measurement. They were also beautiful objects, hand-drawn with attention to detail and artistic flourish, reflecting the tradition of expedition cartography that combined scientific precision with aesthetic presentation. But Fawcett's interest extended beyond mere mapmaking. He observed the landscape with an eye toward understanding its history and potential. The terra preta suggested past civilizations. The patterns in forest composition hinted at long-term human influence. The stories indigenous peoples told about their ancestors described elaborate societies with large settlements, complex social structures, and sophisticated knowledge systems. All of this conflicted with the prevailing European view of the Amazon as a pristine wilderness barely touched by human presence. Fawcett began to wonder whether the Amazon might hold ruins of ancient cities, places where civilizations had flourished before collapsing from disease, warfare, or environmental changes. This idea would grow into an obsession, eventually consuming him and leading to his final expedition in 1925. But during the 1909 journey and subsequent expeditions in the early 1910s, these were still nascent ideas, interesting possibilities rather than driving convictions. The landscape continued to reveal itself slowly. Each expedition added to Fawcett's understanding. Each journey into the forest taught new lessons about how to travel through such terrain, how to find water, how to avoid the worst dangers, how to read signs that indicated whether an area was safe or threatened. The Amazon became less alien with experience, though it never became truly familiar. There was always more to learn, always surprises waiting around the next bend in the river or behind the next wall of vegetation. The early expeditions also gave Fawcett connections with indigenous peoples that would prove valuable. Some groups came to know him as an honest man who kept his word, who didn't steal or destroy property, who treated people with respect. These relationships opened territories that might otherwise have remained closed. Indigenous guides joined his expeditions, bringing invaluable knowledge of routes, resources, and dangers. Without this indigenous assistance, Fawcett's expeditions would have been impossible. The landscape, for all its challenges, was home to people who had lived there for thousands of years. They had solved the problems that seemed so difficult to outsiders. Learning from them was essential for survival, and Fawcett was wise enough to recognize this. The expeditions of 1906 through 1909, and several more that followed in the early 1910s, established Percy Fawcett as one of the foremost explorers of the Amazon. His surveys were accurate and thorough. His reports combined scientific observation with readable narrative. And his growing reputation as someone who could survive in the Amazon's most difficult terrain made him the natural choice when even more challenging expeditions were proposed. The First World War interrupted Fawcett's Amazon work. He returned to Britain and served in the military, experiencing the horror of industrial warfare on the Western Front. The contrast between the trenches of France and the forests of South America could hardly have been more extreme. After the war, Fawcett was changed. The experience had hardened him in some ways while also making the Amazon seem more appealing by comparison. At least in the jungle, the dangers were natural rather than man-made. The forest didn't harbor the senseless slaughter and mechanized death of modern warfare. In 1920, Fawcett returned to South America. He had new survey commissions, but he also had personal goals. The ideas about lost civilizations had crystallized during the war years. He had done research in archives and libraries, reading accounts of early European explorers who had described large settlements and elaborate indigenous cultures along the Amazon in the 1500s and 1600s. These settlements had vanished by the 1700s, victims of European diseases that spread faster than European explorers themselves. If those settlements had existed, Fawcett reasoned, they must have left traces. And if some of the indigenous stories about ancient cities were true, there might be ruins even older, from civilizations that predated European contact by centuries or millennia. The 1920 expedition took Fawcett into the Mato Grosso region of central Brazil, territory he had not previously explored. This region was transitional between the Amazon basin proper and the highlands of central Brazil. The landscape here mixed elements of rainforest with cerrado, the savanna-like grassland ecosystem that dominates Brazil's interior plateau. Hills became more common. Rocky outcrops appeared. The rivers changed character, flowing faster over rocky beds rather than meandering through flat lowlands. The Mato Grosso presented different challenges than the lowland Amazon. The terrain was more varied, requiring constant adjustment. Climbing hills in the tropical heat was exhausting. Descending them was hazardous, with loose rocks and steep slopes threatening falls and injuries. But the varied landscape also broke the monotony and provided better viewpoints for observations and navigation. Fawcett pushed his team hard during this expedition. He was driven by something beyond simple exploration now. He was searching for evidence of ancient civilizations. Every unusual rock formation became a potential carved monument. Every earth mound might be the base of a temple. Patterns in vegetation could indicate buried structures. He examined everything with this lens, interpreting the landscape through the hypothesis that a great civilization had once existed in the Amazon and left traces for those who knew how to look. The region showed increasing signs of past human modification the farther he traveled. More terra preta sites appeared, some covering considerable areas. Earthworks became visible once you knew to look for them, linear features or circular embankments that seemed too regular to be natural. In one location, Fawcett found what he believed were carved stones, though their interpretation was ambiguous. Were they natural formations shaped by weathering, or did they show evidence of human tooling? The landscape of the Mato Grosso also included unique geological features. The Brazilian Shield, ancient crystalline rock that forms the geological core of South America, approaches the surface here. Outcrops of granite and quartzite create ridges and mesas. Some of these formations tower hundreds of meters above the surrounding terrain, creating dramatic landmarks visible from great distances. The Serra do Roncador, the snoring mountains named for the sound wind makes passing through their rock formations, became particularly significant in Fawcett's developing theories. These highland areas hosted different forest types than the lowlands. The trees were shorter overall, and the species composition changed. Pine-like conifers appeared in some areas, unusual in the Amazon context. The understory was often denser, with more shrubs and tangled vegetation. Water became less abundant. During the dry season, streams that flowed during the wet months dried to occasional pools. Finding reliable water sources required more effort and planning. The fauna changed too. Lowland species gave way to animals adapted to the highlands. Different bird species, different insects, different mammals. The transition zones, where lowland and highland environments mixed, showed particularly high diversity, with species from both regions coexisting in narrow bands of appropriate habitat. Fawcett's 1920 expedition lasted months, pushing deep into regions where his maps showed only uncertainty. The team suffered the usual catalogue of tropical hardships. Diseases struck several members. Supplies ran low. Equipment failed. But they persisted, and Fawcett gathered the data he needed for his survey work while also pursuing his search for evidence of lost cities. The expedition eventually turned back, retreating to settled areas before the situation became desperate. Fawcett emerged convinced that he had seen enough to justify further exploration. The terra preta, the earthworks, the indigenous stories, all pointed toward a significant human presence in the Amazon's past. He began planning what would become his final expedition, the 1925 journey from which he would never return. But before following him to that tragic end, we need to understand more about the landscape that would ultimately claim Percy Fawcett and his companions. The Serra do Roncador, the Snoring Mountains, rise from the landscape of central Brazil like ancient monuments. These highlands represent a different world from the lowland Amazon, a transition zone where the endless flat rainforest gives way to rocky plateaus, where rivers cascade down escarpments, and where the very character of the landscape changes dramatically within short distances. The Serra do Roncador forms part of the Brazilian Shield, a geological structure composed of some of the oldest rocks on Earth. These formations date back billions of years, to times when the planet was still young and continents were assembling and breaking apart in configurations that would be unrecognizable today. The rocks themselves tell stories of immense age and geological violence. Metamorphic formations, twisted and compressed by ancient tectonic forces, create stripe patterns in cliff faces. Granite intrusions form massive outcrops that resist erosion while softer surrounding rocks wear away, leaving the granite standing as isolated towers and ridges. The mountains aren't particularly tall by global standards. The highest peaks reach only around 800 to 1,000 meters above sea level. But in the context of the surrounding lowlands, they dominate. From distances of 50 or even 100 kilometers, the serras appear as dark lines on the horizon, landmarks visible across vast expanses of forest or savanna. For travelers, they served as navigation aids, features that could be identified and used to maintain orientation. The name Snoring Mountains comes from the sound wind makes passing through narrow gaps and caves in the rock formations. On certain days, when conditions are right, the mountains produce a low, resonant sound that carries for considerable distances. Indigenous peoples attributed various meanings to these sounds, seeing them as voices of spirits or ancestors. Early European travelers found the sounds unsettling, particularly when heard at night, echoing across the darkened landscape like the breathing of some enormous sleeping creature. Approaching the Serras, the landscape transitions gradually. The flat lowlands give way to gentle hills. The vegetation changes, with forest becoming patchier, interrupted more frequently by savanna-like clearings. Rocky outcrops appear with increasing frequency, breaking through the soil cover. Streams flow faster, cutting through bedrock rather than meandering through alluvial deposits. The change is not abrupt but rather a gradual shift across dozens of kilometers. At the base of the Serras, the transition becomes more dramatic. Here the land begins to rise more steeply. The forest, where it persists, clings to slopes and valley bottoms. The hilltops often support only scrubby vegetation, unable to establish in the thin soil that accumulates on rock surfaces. Trails, whether animal paths or indigenous routes, seek out the easiest passages, following valleys and gentle slopes rather than attempting direct ascents of the steeper faces. Climbing into the Serras reveals new landscapes with nearly every 100 meters of elevation gain. The lowland forest species give way to highland variants. Trees are shorter, more gnarled, shaped by exposure to stronger winds. The canopy becomes more broken, allowing more light to reach the ground. This increased light supports a denser understory of shrubs and small plants. Bromeliads and other epiphytes grow more abundantly, taking advantage of the regular mists that form when humid air from the lowlands encounters the cooler temperatures of elevation. Water behaves differently in the highlands. Rather than the slow, meandering rivers of the lowlands, highland streams rush and tumble over rocks. Waterfalls appear frequently, where streams reach ledges or escarpments. Some of these falls are spectacular, plunging tens of meters in single drops, creating mist and spray that waters the surrounding vegetation and creates miniature rainforest conditions in an otherwise drier environment. The sound of falling water becomes a constant companion in many parts of the Serras, a backdrop that varies in intensity but rarely disappears completely. Rock formations take on extraordinary shapes through millions of years of erosion. Pillars of resistant stone stand isolated from the main ridges. Balanced rocks, precariously perched on narrow bases, look as though they should topple but have stood for millennia. Caves and overhangs hollow out where softer rock layers have eroded away faster than harder layers above. Some of these caves are extensive, penetrating deep into the mountains, their interiors cool and dark, dripping with water that slowly dissolves minerals and deposits them as stalactites and stalagmites. These caves attracted both animals and humans. Various species use caves as shelter, from bats that roost by the thousands to jaguars that den in cave mouths to raise cubs. Indigenous peoples used caves as campsites, shelters during storms, and ceremonial sites. Evidence of this human use appears as smoke stains on ceilings, rock art on walls, and occasionally as artifacts left behind by ancient visitors. The rock art particularly fascinated explorers like Fawcett. On cliff faces and cave walls throughout the Serras, ancient peoples painted or carved images. Some are geometric patterns, spirals and zigzags and parallel lines whose meanings remain mysterious. Others are representational, showing animals, human figures, and scenes that might depict hunts or ceremonies or historical events. The age of this art is difficult to determine without modern dating techniques, but some of it is clearly very old, weathered almost to invisibility, while other images appear more recent. Fawcett saw these rock art sites as potential evidence for his theories about ancient civilizations. He believed that some of the more elaborate images, particularly geometric patterns that showed consistent mathematical relationships, indicated sophisticated knowledge systems. Whether he was right remains debated. The rock art certainly demonstrates that humans have inhabited the Brazilian highlands for thousands of years and that they had cultural traditions worth recording on permanent surfaces. But whether this implies the kind of lost civilization Fawcett imagined is less clear. The ecology of the highlands differs significantly from the lowlands. The combination of elevation, exposure, and seasonal drought creates conditions that favor different communities of organisms. The highland forests, where they occur, are lower and more open than lowland rainforests. Individual trees can be massive, with thick trunks and spreading canopies, but they stand farther apart. The forest floor receives more light and supports a grassy understory in many areas, creating a savanna woodland mix rather than closed forest. Birds of the highlands include many species that don't occur in the lowlands. Parrots and parakeets of various species gather at fruiting trees. Tanagers, brilliantly colored songbirds, flit through the canopy. Hawks and caracaras soar on thermals rising from sun-warmed rocks. At night, owls and nightjars call from the darkness. The diversity may be lower than in lowland forests, but the highland species include many spectacular forms. Mammals adapted to highland conditions show their own specializations. Deer browse in the more open woodlands. Coatis, relatives of raccoons, forage in groups, their ringed tails held high as they search for insects and fruits. Monkeys, though less diverse than in the lowlands, include species adapted to the cooler conditions and more seasonal food availability. Predators include pumas and smaller cats, all seeking prey in the varied terrain. The seasonal patterns in the highlands are more pronounced than in the lowlands. The dry season can last for months, during which little or no rain falls. Streams diminish to occasional pools. The vegetation becomes drought-stressed, with some plants losing leaves while others persist through drought adaptations. Fires become a risk, started by lightning strikes or human activity, spreading through the dried vegetation. These fires, while destructive in the short term, play a role in maintaining the savanna woodland mosaic, preventing forest from completely taking over. When the rains return, the transformation is dramatic. Within days, the landscape greens. Dormant plants leaf out. Seeds that have waited months for moisture germinate. Streams swell and resume their rushing flow. Waterfalls that had been mere trickles during the dry season become thundering cascades. The change is like a switch being flipped, the landscape moving from one stable state to another in response to the arriving monsoon. Fawcett traveled through the Serra do Roncador region multiple times. He was drawn to these highlands by their dramatic landscapes and by stories he had heard about ancient ruins hidden in the mountains. The indigenous peoples of the region spoke of cities in the interior, though whether they meant actual urban settlements or simply large villages or ceremonial centers was unclear. Language barriers and the use of translators who might not fully understand what was being said added ambiguity to these accounts. The logistics of exploring the highlands differed from lowland expeditions. Water, so abundant in the Amazon basin, became a limiting resource during the dry season. Expeditions had to plan routes that followed streams or visited known springs. Carrying sufficient water for a multi-day journey across dry highlands was impractical, so routes were constrained by water availability. This made exploration more difficult in some ways, though the more open terrain and better visibility partially compensated. The highlands also offered better camping conditions in many ways. The ground was often drier and firmer than in the lowlands. Insects, while still present, were generally less overwhelming. The nights were cooler, sometimes almost cold by tropical standards, which made sleep more comfortable. The more open views meant that camps could be positioned to watch for approaching dangers, weather storms or hostile visitors. But the highlands had their own hazards. The terrain was more rugged, with greater risk of falls and injuries. Rocky slopes could be treacherous, especially when wet. Flash floods were a danger during the rainy season, as water funneled into narrow valleys and surged downstream with little warning. Lightning strikes were more frequent on exposed ridges and peaks. And the greater temperature fluctuations meant that hypothermia became a concern during wet, cool nights, something that never happened in the lowlands. The vegetation of the highlands included many plant species that produced useful materials. Various palms provided fibers for rope and leaves for thatching. Trees produced resins used for waterproofing and adhesives. Medicinal plants grew in abundance, known to indigenous peoples who used them to treat various ailments. Fawcett learned some of this plant lore from his indigenous companions, though his knowledge remained superficial compared to people who had grown up using these resources. The geological diversity of the highlands meant that minerals and ores occurred more frequently than in the lowlands. Outcrops of quartz crystals, some quite large, appeared in weathered rock. Iron ores stained rocks rusty red. Gold, in small quantities, could be panned from some streams, though not in concentrations that would attract major mining operations. These minerals had attracted human attention for millennia. Ancient peoples had certainly known about and used some of these resources, creating tools and ornaments from available materials. Fawcett speculated that more significant mineral deposits might exist, perhaps providing motivation for ancient civilizations to establish themselves in the region. He envisioned lost cities built of stone, positioned to control resources or trade routes, places that might have been centers of power before some catastrophe caused their abandonment. Whether such places ever existed remains an open question. Modern archaeology in the Amazon has revealed that indigenous societies were often larger and more complex than early researchers believed, but whether they built the kind of stone cities Fawcett imagined is still debated. The highlands served as a water source for much of the surrounding lowlands. Rivers originating in the Serras flowed outward in all directions, carrying water from the highlands to the plains below. These rivers cut deep valleys as they descended, creating dramatic gorges in some locations. Following a river upstream from the lowlands eventually led to the highlands, a natural route for exploration and travel. Indigenous peoples certainly used these river valleys as routes between different environments, moving seasonally or to access different resources. The meeting of highland and lowland environments created particularly productive zones. These transition areas, called ecotones, hosted species from both environments plus specialists adapted to the transitional conditions themselves. Biodiversity often peaked in these ecotones, making them important areas for wildlife and attractive locations for human settlement. Many indigenous communities positioned themselves at these transitions, taking advantage of resources from both highlands and lowlands. Fawcett understood intuitively that edges and transitions were often the most interesting and important parts of the landscape. He paid particular attention to these areas, noting the changes in vegetation, observing wildlife concentrations, and looking for signs of past human activity. If ancient civilizations had existed, they would likely have positioned themselves at these productive intersections between different environments, just as people throughout history have tended to settle in places where diverse resources converged. The Serra do Roncador remains remote and challenging to access even today. Large parts of the region are protected as indigenous reserves or conservation areas. The landscapes that Fawcett saw have changed relatively little in the centuries since his explorations. The forests, the savannas, the rocky outcrops, and the waterfalls all persist much as they were. This persistence is both reassuring, in that some wild places remain, and sobering, as it reminds us how easily a person could vanish into such vastness and never be found. After the First World War and his 1920 expedition, Percy Fawcett spent years planning and preparing for what he intended as his culminating exploration. He had refined his theories about ancient civilizations in the Amazon. He had identified specific regions where he believed evidence might be found. And he had developed the determination to mount an expedition that would, he hoped, make discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of pre-Columbian South America. The 1920 expedition, while not finding the ruins Fawcett sought, had reinforced his conviction that they existed. He had seen more terra preta sites, more earthworks, more evidence of past human landscape modification. He had heard more indigenous stories about ancient cities and powerful ancestors. And he had visited regions that seemed, to his eyes, to show signs of ancient stonework, though others who examined his photographs and descriptions remained skeptical. Fawcett faced significant challenges in organizing his final expedition. Funding was difficult to secure. Many potential sponsors were skeptical of his claims about lost cities, viewing them as romantic fantasy rather than serious archaeology. The British establishment, while respecting Fawcett's surveying accomplishments, considered his theories about Amazonian civilizations to be eccentric at best. The academic archaeologists of the period were convinced that the Amazon had never supported complex societies, that the poor soils and challenging environment had limited human populations to small, scattered groups of hunter-gatherers. This view, while sincerely held, was wrong. Modern archaeology has thoroughly demonstrated that the pre-Columbian Amazon hosted substantial populations living in complex societies. The terra preta soils that Fawcett observed are now understood to be anthropogenic, created by indigenous peoples through long-term soil management. Earthworks visible from the air in parts of the Amazon include massive geoglyphs, ditches and embankments arranged in geometric patterns covering many square kilometers. Some sites show evidence of large, permanent settlements with sophisticated ceramics, long-distance trade networks, and complex social organization. But this understanding came decades after Fawcett's time. In the 1920s, the prevailing view was that the Amazon was and always had been a green desert, rich in species but poor in the resources needed to support human civilization. Fawcett's ideas contradicted this paradigm, and paradigms are not easily challenged. So he struggled to find support for his plans. Eventually, Fawcett secured modest funding from a combination of sources, including newspaper rights to his story and personal funds. He made the decision to travel with a small party, reasoning that a smaller group would be more mobile, require less supplies, and attract less unwanted attention. He chose to take his oldest son, Jack Fawcett, then in his early 20s, and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel, of similar age. It would be just the three of them plus whatever local guides they hired along the way. This decision to travel light and small has been debated ever since. A larger expedition with more supplies and personnel might have had better chances of success but would have been more expensive and more difficult to manage. A small party could move quickly and avoid some of the logistical nightmares of organizing large groups. But a small party had less redundancy, less ability to cope with emergencies, and fewer people to seek help if something went wrong. Fawcett's plan was to enter the Amazon from the eastern side, traveling west through the Mato Grosso region and into the Serra do Roncador. He had specific coordinates in mind, locations where he believed ruins might be found based on his research and previous explorations. He intended to reach these locations, document whatever he found, and return with evidence that would vindicate his theories and secure funding for more extensive work. The expedition departed from Cuiabá, a frontier town in Mato Grosso, in April 1925. They had supplies for several months, basic equipment, instruments for navigation and surveying, and high hopes. The early stages went smoothly. They traveled through territory Fawcett knew from earlier expeditions, following established routes, making good progress. Fawcett sent several letters back from the trail, carried by guides who were returning to civilization. These letters described their progress, mentioned the landscapes they were passing through, and expressed optimism about the journey ahead. The last confirmed message from Fawcett was sent from a place called Dead Horse Camp on May 29, 1925. The name itself suggests the difficulties of the territory. In this message, Fawcett reported that they were about to enter unexplored region and that he expected to be out of contact for some time. This was not unusual. Expeditions into the deep interior could be gone for months without any communication. But this time, they never emerged. Months passed without word from Fawcett. Then a year. Then years. His wife, Nina Fawcett, remained convinced he was alive, conducting his explorations in some remote area, perhaps having gone native with indigenous peoples, perhaps held up by circumstances but intending to return when possible. Search expeditions were organized, more than a dozen over the following decades. Some found fragmentary clues, items that might have belonged to the Fawcett party, indigenous stories about white men passing through various territories. But no definitive evidence emerged. The landscape that Fawcett entered was, and remains, one of the most challenging on Earth. The Zinga River region of Mato Grosso, near where Fawcett disappeared, is a patchwork of forest and savanna, with extensive areas of transitional vegetation. The indigenous peoples of this region, particularly the Kalapalo and related groups, had limited contact with outsiders in 1925 and were understandably wary of strangers entering their territories. The Kalapalo themselves told various stories about Fawcett over the years. Some said that the expedition had passed through peacefully and continued westward. Others suggested that neighboring groups might have killed the explorers, viewing them as threats. Still others hinted that Fawcett might have settled with indigenous peoples, either voluntarily or as a captive, living out his days in some remote village. The stories varied, sometimes contradicted each other, and were filtered through multiple languages and cultural contexts, making it difficult to determine what actually happened. The physical landscape where Fawcett disappeared is a mix of the forest and savanna environments we've discussed. The Zinga region contains extensive cerrado, the Brazilian savanna ecosystem dominated by grasses and scattered trees. These savannas can stretch for dozens of kilometers, open country under enormous skies, where visibility extends to the horizon and the sense of scale becomes overwhelming. Walking across cerrado, especially during the dry season when the grass has been burned or dried to straw, is relatively easy compared to forest travel, but the exposure brings its own challenges. The sun beats down relentlessly. Shade is scarce. Water sources are widely spaced. And the openness, while visually freeing after the claustrophobic forest, can be disorienting in its own way, lacking the landmarks needed for navigation. Patches of forest interrupt the savanna, growing where soil conditions or microtopography provide sufficient moisture. These forest patches, called cerrado when they're particularly dense, offer relief from the sun and access to different resources. The boundary between savanna and forest can be quite sharp, stepping from open grassland into shaded woodland within a few meters. These ecotones host their own communities of specialists, species that thrive in the transition zones between environments. The rivers of the Zinga Basin differ from the larger rivers Fawcett had navigated earlier. They're smaller, shallower, more seasonal. During the wet season they flow strongly, but during the dry season they can shrink to chains of disconnected pools. Rapids and waterfalls are frequent, making boat travel difficult and portaging common. The rivers meander extensively through the flatlands, and following one can mean traveling 3 or 4 kilometers for every kilometer of direct progress. Crossing savanna on foot, while easier than forest in some ways, brought its own catalogue of discomforts and dangers. The sun was intense. Without the forest canopy for shade, travelers were exposed to full tropical sun for hours at a stretch. Sunburn became a concern. Dehydration could set in quickly if water intake didn't keep pace with sweating. The heat radiating from the ground added to the burden, and by afternoon the air shimmered with heat haze, distorting distant views and making navigation by landmarks more difficult. Fires were a constant presence during the dry season. lightning strikes ignited grass that had dried to tinder. Indigenous peoples also used fire as a management tool, burning sections of savanna to promote fresh growth that would attract game animals, clear areas for planting, or drive animals during hunts. The smoke from these fires could be seen from great distances, dark columns rising into the sky. The smell of burning grass and wood permeated everything. At night, lines of fire glowed on the horizon, advancing slowly across the landscape, consuming old growth and preparing the ground for renewal. Walking through recently burned savanna revealed the resilience of the ecosystem. Within days of a fire, new green shoots emerged from below-ground roots and rhizomes. Certain plants actually required fire to complete their life cycles, with seeds that germinated only after exposure to the heat of flames. Within weeks, the black ash transformed to fresh grassland. Within months, it was difficult to tell that fire had passed through, though careful observation revealed signs in the patterns of regrowth and the ages of woody plants. The fauna of the Cerrado adapted to the fire regime. Many animals could simply flee advancing fires. Birds flew away. Mammals ran or retreated to burrows. But some species timed their life cycles around the fire season. Certain birds nested during the rainy season when fires were unlikely. Insects emerged from underground refuges after fires had passed. The ecosystem, far from being destroyed by fire, depended on it to maintain the open character that defined the habitat. For human travelers, fires could be threats or tools. A fire advancing across dry grassland could move quickly, driven by wind, overtaking someone on foot if the conditions were right. Fawcett and his companions would have needed to be alert for smoke and flames, ready to move to areas already burned or to use rivers and streams as fire breaks. But fires also created benefits. They cleared undergrowth and made travel easier. They exposed the ground and made it easier to spot tracks or find dropped items. And they could be used strategically, set to drive game animals or clear campsites. The Cerrado's soils varied considerably. In some areas, the soil was sandy and well-drained, supporting grassland with scattered shrubs and small trees. In other areas, clay soils that hardened during the dry season and became waterlogged during the rains created conditions suitable for different plant communities. Termite mounds dotted the landscape, some rising 2 or 3 meters tall, built from soil particles cemented with termite saliva. These mounds were engineering marvels, with internal ventilation systems that kept the colony at constant temperature despite external temperature fluctuations. The Cerrado's trees, while not as tall as rainforest giants, developed their own distinctive characteristics. Many had thick, corky bark that protected them from fire. Twisted, gnarled trunks reflected repeated topkill from fires and regrowth from surviving roots. Some trees had enormous underground root systems, with more biomass below ground than above, allowing them to survive fires, droughts, and other disturbances by retreating into their underground reserves and then resprouting when conditions improved. Fawcett would have traveled through this landscape during the transition between wet and dry seasons. April, when they departed, falls at the end of the rainy season in central Brazil. The savannas would have been green, the rivers flowing strongly. But as they progressed deeper and as the months passed, the dry season would have begun. The landscape would have gradually transformed from lush to desiccated. Water would have become harder to find. The physical conditions would have become more challenging. The indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Kalapalo, had adapted to these conditions through millennia of experience. They knew where to find water during the dry season, which plants provided food and medicine, how to read the landscape for signs of game animals, and how to travel efficiently through varied terrain. For outsiders without this knowledge, the Cerrado could be deadly. Getting lost was easy in the repetitive landscape. Water sources that existed during the wet season might be dry. Game animals, while present, could be difficult to hunt without knowledge of their habits and habitats. The forest patches in the Cerrado provided crucial resources. Here shade, water, and concentrated plant and animal resources occurred. Indigenous groups often positioned their main settlements near these forest patches, taking advantage of the resources while also accessing the open savannas for hunting and agriculture. The forest patches varied in size from a few hectares to extensive areas covering many square kilometers. Moving between these patches, crossing the intervening savanna, required planning and awareness of conditions. The Kalapalo and related groups practiced a form of agriculture adapted to the Cerrado landscape. They cleared small areas, usually in forest patches or along rivers where soil was more fertile, and planted crops including manioc, corn, and various fruits. These gardens required work to maintain, clearing competition from weeds and defending against pests, but they provided reliable food sources to supplement hunting and gathering. The gardens were often positioned near permanent water sources and were tended primarily by women while men focused on hunting and fishing. The villages themselves were carefully positioned in locations that offered access to diverse resources, defense against potential enemies, and good living conditions. Houses were constructed from local materials, using wood frames covered with palm thatch or grass. The villages were often arranged in circles or arcs, with a central plaza used for ceremonies and gatherings. During the dry season, when fires threatened, the cleared areas around villages served as fire breaks, protecting the houses from advancing flames. Fawcett's interactions with indigenous groups during his final expedition remain largely unknown. The last confirmed message mentioned entering territory of uncertain friendliness. Whether he encountered hostility, friendly reception, or simply never made contact before some other fate befell him is unclear. The indigenous peoples of the region had every reason to be wary of outsiders. The history of contact had been overwhelmingly negative, bringing disease, violence, and cultural disruption. Strangers entering tribal territory would be watched, evaluated, and potentially seen as threats. The landscape itself could kill without any human agency. A fall in rugged terrain could result in broken bones, immobilizing someone without hope of rescue. Infections could turn deadly without antibiotics. Venomous snakes, while rare, existed and could deliver fatal bites. Disease-carrying insects transmitted malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses. Starvation was possible if game proved scarce and supplies ran out. Drowning in river crossings or flash floods remained constant risks. Any of these could have ended the expedition without leaving clear evidence. The vastness of the landscape is difficult to overstate. Even today, with satellite imagery and aerial surveys, large parts of the Amazon and Cerrado remain poorly known. In 1925, the region where Fawcett disappeared was truly remote, days or weeks from the nearest settlements, without roads, without radio communication, without any infrastructure that could aid in rescue or search. Once the expedition entered this region, they were entirely on their own. The possibility that Fawcett deliberately disappeared, starting a new life in the interior, has been suggested but seems unlikely given his character and his relationships with his wife and children. He was driven to prove his theories, to make discoveries that would secure his reputation and vindicate years of work. Simply vanishing into the jungle would have accomplished none of his goals. More likely, something went wrong, some combination of circumstances that prevented the expedition from returning but also prevented their fate from being clearly determined. Over the decades since 1925, the Fawcett disappearance has become one of exploration's great mysteries. Theories abound. Books have been written. Films have been made. Expeditions have searched for evidence. But the landscape that claimed Percy Fawcett, Jack Fawcett, and Raleigh Rimmel has kept its secrets. The forest, the savanna, the rivers that they navigated have absorbed them completely, leaving only questions and speculation. The landscapes of the Amazon do hold evidence of past civilizations, though perhaps not in the form Fawcett imagined. Modern archaeology using techniques like LiDAR, which can see through forest canopy to reveal ground features, has discovered extensive networks of earthworks, road systems, and settlement patterns that demonstrate complex societies existed throughout the Amazon basin. The terra preta that Fawcett observed is now understood to indicate sustained human presence and sophisticated soil management. Remains of large villages, ceremonial centers, and defensive works have been documented across regions once thought to be pristine wilderness. These discoveries have vindicated some of Fawcett's intuitions, if not his specific theories. He was right that the Amazon had hosted significant human populations and complex societies. He was right that the prevailing academic view of the Amazon as unsuitable for civilization was incorrect. But whether the lost cities he sought actually existed in the form he imagined remains uncertain. The archaeological evidence shows impressive human achievement but also reveals societies quite different from the classical civilizations of other regions. The indigenous peoples themselves, the descendants of those ancient societies, carry knowledge of their histories and landscapes. Their oral traditions preserve information about the past, though translated and interpreted through cultural frameworks that may differ significantly from Western expectations. Learning to listen to and understand these traditions, treating them as valid sources of knowledge rather than mere folklore, represents an important shift in how archaeology and history approach the Amazon. The Amazon's landscapes continue to reveal their secrets slowly. As technology improves and as research methods become more sophisticated, more evidence emerges about the region's past. The challenge is to conduct this research ethically, in partnership with indigenous communities, respecting their rights and knowledge while also expanding scientific understanding. The landscape itself deserves respect, protection, and careful study rather than exploitation. Percy Fawcett's expeditions contributed to geographical knowledge of the Amazon through his accurate surveys and detailed observations. His maps helped define international boundaries and provided information about previously unknown regions. His writings, while sometimes speculative, contained valuable ethnographic observations about indigenous peoples and their relationships with the landscape. And his fate, tragic as it was, highlighted the Amazon's power and the risks inherent in exploration of such difficult terrain. The question of what specifically happened to Fawcett may never be answered with certainty. The landscape has changed in the century since his disappearance. Rivers have shifted course. Forests have grown and been cut. Indigenous territories have been impacted by outside pressures. Even if remains were found, identifying them conclusively would be challenging. But the mystery itself has value, reminding us that some places on Earth remain wild enough, remote enough, complex enough to resist complete human mastery. The Amazon's ecology represents one of Earth's great natural systems. The swamps that challenged Fawcett and countless other travelers through the Amazon represent extreme versions of the forest's waterlogged conditions. These wetland environments, while difficult for humans, support specialized communities of organisms adapted to permanent or seasonal inundation. Permanent swamps occur in low-lying areas where groundwater remains at or above the surface year-round. The soils are saturated, often consisting of thick deposits of organic material, partially decomposed plant matter that accumulates faster than it can break down completely. This organic material, called peat in some contexts, can be several meters deep, representing centuries or millennia of accumulation. Walking on such surfaces feels spongy, each step compressing the material and sometimes releasing bubbles of methane gas that has formed during anaerobic decomposition below. The trees in permanent swamps must tolerate constant flooding. Many develop specialized root structures to cope with these conditions. Prop roots, which extend from the trunk and arch down to the ground, provide stability in the soft substrate while also increasing the surface area for gas exchange. Pneumatophores, root structures that grow upward from underground roots and protrude above the water surface, allow the tree to obtain oxygen when the soil is saturated and anaerobic. These adaptations give swamp forests distinctive appearances, with their root systems as visually prominent as their trunks and canopies. The water in permanent swamps is often stained brown with tannins, similar to black water rivers. It moves slowly if at all, creating stagnant conditions in some areas. The lack of current allows sediment to settle, and the water can be remarkably clear beneath its dark color, allowing visibility of several meters in some cases. But the clarity is deceptive, as the bottom is often soft mud rather than firm ground, and depths can vary dramatically over short distances. Swamp forests support unique fauna. Caimans thrive in these environments, their populations often higher in swamps than in rivers. The abundant fish populations and relatively safe basking sites make swamps ideal caiman habitat. Some species of fish have adapted specifically to swamp conditions, developing the ability to breathe air when dissolved oxygen in the water drops too low. The lungfish-like characteristics of some Amazonian species allow them to survive in conditions that would kill most other fish. Birds particularly abundant in swamps include herons and egrets, wading birds that stalk fish, and amphibians in the shallows. The hoatzin, an unusual bird found only in Amazonian swamps, is sometimes called the stink bird due to the unpleasant odor produced by its digestive system. Hoatzins feed on leaves, unusual for birds, and ferment the plant material in an enlarged crop, producing odors similar to cow manure. Despite this unappealing characteristic, hoatzins are remarkable birds, and their chicks possess claws on their wings that they use to climb branches, a primitive feature rare in modern birds. Amphibians reach their highest diversity in and around Amazonian swamps. Frogs and toads of numerous species call from the vegetation, their choruses creating symphonies that can be almost overwhelming in volume and complexity. Some species lay eggs in water. Others lay eggs in foam nests that hang above water. Still others carry eggs on their backs or in specialized pouches. The variety of reproductive strategies reflects the diversity of the amphibian fauna and the range of microhabitats available in swamp ecosystems. For human travelers, swamps represented serious obstacles. Crossing them often meant wading through water of uncertain depth, struggling through mud that gripped feet and legs, and dealing with vegetation that tangled and caught on clothing and equipment. The physical effort was exhausting, and the risk of losing equipment or supplies in the water was constant. Finding dry ground for camping after a day of swamp travel was crucial, and sometimes required traveling well past the time one would normally stop, extending into darkness to reach firm ground. Seasonal swamps, which flood during the wet season and dry during the dry season, presented a different set of conditions. During floods, these areas might be impassable, with water too deep for wading but too choked with vegetation for boat travel. During the dry season, the same areas could be surprisingly easy to cross, with firm ground and minimal obstacles. Timing expeditions to coincide with favorable seasonal conditions was important when routes passed through such areas. The transition between wet and dry phases in seasonal swamps was dramatic. As floodwaters receded, fish became concentrated in shrinking pools, attracting large numbers of predators. Caimans, herons, and even jaguars congregated at these temporary pools, creating spectacular feeding frenzies. The trapped fish had nowhere to escape, and the predators took full advantage. Indigenous peoples also timed fishing activities to coincide with these concentrations, using nets, traps, or even bare hands to catch fish in the shallow water. As the ground dried, vegetation responded quickly. Seeds that had lain dormant underwater germinated within days. Fast-growing annual plants colonized the exposed mud. Within weeks, what had been aquatic environment transformed into terrestrial habitat, at least temporarily. This rapid transformation reflected adaptations honed over countless cycles of flood and drought. The Cerrado, the Brazilian savanna ecosystem, occupies vast areas of central Brazil and extends into parts of Bolivia and Paraguay. This environment contrasts sharply with rainforest but is equally complex and important. The Cerrado is characterized by grassland interspersed with scattered trees and shrubs, creating a parkland-like appearance in many areas. The grasses can grow tall, sometimes reaching 2 meters or more, creating a sea of vegetation that waves in the wind. The Cerrado experiences strongly seasonal rainfall. The wet season, roughly October through April, brings regular rains and lush growth. The dry season, May through September, sees little to no precipitation, and the landscape transforms. Grasses dry to yellow or brown. Many trees lose their leaves. The vegetation becomes tinder dry, vulnerable to fire. This seasonal cycling is fundamental to the Cerrado ecosystem, driving patterns of growth, reproduction, and survival for all organisms. The Cerrado's biodiversity, while perhaps less spectacular than the rainforests in terms of sheer species numbers, is nonetheless impressive. The plant diversity is particularly high, with thousands of species adapted to the savanna conditions. Many Cerrado plants are endemic, found nowhere else on Earth. This reflects the Cerrado's age as an ecosystem and its history of isolation from other savanna regions, allowing unique species assemblages to evolve. The Cerrado's trees develop characteristic forms. Many are twisted and gnarled, with thick bark that protects them from fire. The bark often has a corky texture, providing insulation that prevents heat from reaching living tissues during fires. Some species can survive even intense fires that completely consume their above-ground growth, resprouting from underground structures called xylopodia, massive woody root systems that store energy and nutrients. The underground component of Cerrado ecosystems is often underappreciated. Many Cerrado plants invest more biomass below ground than above ground, with root systems that can extend 10 or even 20 meters deep, reaching water tables that remain accessible even during the dry season. This massive underground biomass represents a significant carbon store and plays crucial roles in nutrient cycling and water dynamics. The fauna of the Cerrado includes many large mammals that would have been familiar to Fawcett. Giant anteaters, bizarre creatures with elongated snouts and massive claws, feed on termites and ants, using their powerful forelegs to tear open termite mounds and their long, sticky tongues to extract insects. Armadillos of various species burrow in the Cerrado soil, emerging at night to forage. The giant armadillo, which can weigh 60 kilograms or more, creates enormous burrows that can be used as dens by other species after the armadillos abandon them. Maned wolves, despite their name, are not actually wolves but rather members of their own unique genus. These tall, long-legged canids look almost fox-like but stand nearly a meter at the shoulder. They roam the Cerrado hunting small mammals, birds, and reptiles, and they also eat significant quantities of fruit, particularly a tomato-like fruit called lobiare or fruit of the wolf. The relationship between maned wolves and this fruit appears to be mutualistic, with wolves dispersing seeds while gaining nutrition from the fruits. The Cerrado's birds include many spectacular species. The rhea, a large flightless bird related to ostriches, roams open country in small groups. Various species of tinamous, chicken-like birds with cryptic plumage, hide in grass and burst into flight when disturbed. Parrots and parakeets gather at fruiting trees. Raptors circle on thermals, searching for prey in the grasslands below. For Fawcett, traveling through Cerrado meant exposure to elements largely absent in the forest. The sky dominated, vast and blue during the dry season, often filled with dramatic clouds during the wet season. The sun's heat was direct and intense without the forest canopy for protection. Winds blew freely, sometimes welcome cooling breezes, other times hot blasts that dried and chapped exposed skin. The visual experience was entirely different from the forest, with distant views extending to the horizon, allowing navigation by landmarks but also creating a sense of vulnerability and exposure. Finding water in the Cerrado during the dry season required knowledge of the landscape. Streams that flowed during the wet season often dried to disconnected pools or disappeared entirely. But certain locations, springs emerging where water tables intersected the surface, remained reliable. Indigenous peoples knew these locations and monitored them carefully. For outsiders, finding water could be a matter of life and death. Following game trails sometimes led to water, as animals also needed to drink and often took the most direct routes to reliable sources. The Cerrado's relationship with fire is complex and has been debated extensively. Fire is clearly a natural part of the ecosystem, with lightning strikes causing fires long before human arrival. Many Cerrado species are adapted to fire, even dependent on it for reproduction or competitive advantage. But humans have modified fire regimes for thousands of years, burning the Cerrado for various purposes. The natural fire regime, if such a thing exists, is probably impossible to determine given the long history of human influence. Contemporary conservation of the Cerrado faces significant challenges. Much of the Cerrado has been converted to agriculture, particularly soybean and cattle production. The flat terrain, reasonable rainfall, and improving soil amendment techniques have made the Cerrado attractive for intensive farming. The conversion has been rapid and extensive, with estimates suggesting that over half of the original Cerrado has been transformed. Remaining Cerrado often persists in fragments, raising concerns about long-term viability of ecosystems and populations. The landscape where faucet disappeared included extensive Cerrado along with forest patches and transition zones. This patchwork of habitats created diverse conditions but also created navigational challenges. Routes that looked promising from a distance might dead-end at impassable forest tangles or seasonal swamps. Water sources might be farther apart than expected. And the indigenous peoples of the region, while adapted to these conditions, were dealing with their own challenges as outside pressures began to impact their territories. The archaeological evidence from the Cerrado region has grown significantly since Fawcett's time. Large earthworks, some enclosing areas of many hectares, have been documented. These structures suggest organized labor and social complexity. Ceramic traditions show artistic sophistication and long-term cultural continuity. Rock art sites, similar to those Fawcett observed, are now recognized as important cultural heritage. The picture that emerges is of landscapes that were inhabited and modified by humans for millennia, not pristine wilderness but rather cultural landscapes shaped by indigenous peoples. The search for evidence of lost civilizations in the Amazon continues, but with different approaches than Fawcett employed. Modern researchers use technologies like LiDAR, satellite imagery, and ground-penetrating radar to detect features invisible to ground-level observers. They work in partnership with indigenous communities, incorporating traditional knowledge into research frameworks. And they approach the question with more nuanced understanding of what civilization means, recognizing that complexity and sophistication can take many forms beyond stone cities and written records. The landscapes themselves remain largely intact in many areas, particularly where indigenous territories have been established and protected. These protected areas serve multiple purposes, safeguarding indigenous rights while also preserving ecosystems and the knowledge systems that have developed over millennia of human landscape interaction. The recognition that indigenous peoples are not obstacles to conservation but rather essential partners represents an important shift in thinking. Fawcett's legacy is complicated. His surveys contributed genuine scientific knowledge. His observations, while sometimes interpreted through his own biases and theories, contained valuable information. His determination to challenge prevailing assumptions about the Amazon's human history, while not always correct in details, was ultimately vindicated as evidence mounted for complex pre-Columbian societies. But his fate also serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of exploration and the dangers of becoming too obsessed with particular theories. The mystery of his disappearance has inspired countless people to explore the Amazon, both literally through search expeditions and figuratively through reading and imagination. The Amazon itself has become more accessible, with roads penetrating what were once roadless regions, with airstrips allowing access to remote areas, with technology making communication and navigation easier. But accessibility brings its own challenges, including deforestation, resource extraction, and cultural disruption. The green world that Fawcett knew, while changed in many ways, persists. The Amazon continues to host the world's greatest river system and largest rainforest. Indigenous peoples continue to inhabit their traditional territories, maintaining cultural practices while also adapting to changing circumstances. And the landscape itself, the rivers and forests and savannas, continues to shape life in ways both obvious and subtle. The Amazon's future is uncertain. Climate change, deforestation, and other pressures threaten the ecosystem's integrity. Some models suggest that large-scale forest loss could push the Amazon past a tipping point, transforming rainforest into savanna across extensive areas. Such a transformation would have global consequences, affecting carbon cycles, weather patterns, and biodiversity. Preventing this requires action at multiple scales, from local conservation efforts to international cooperation. But there are also reasons for hope. Indigenous peoples continue to defend their territories and maintain forests far more effectively than outside conservation efforts alone. Growing recognition of the Amazon's importance has led to conservation initiatives and protected areas. Scientific understanding of the ecosystem has improved dramatically, providing better information for management decisions. And the resilience of the Amazon itself, demonstrated through millennia of climatic variation and disturbance, suggests that with appropriate protection, these landscapes can persist. Percy Fawcett's story reminds us of our complicated relationship with wilderness. We are drawn to wild places, fascinated by their beauty and mystery, challenged by their difficulty. We want to understand them, map them, explain them. But in doing so, we sometimes fail to appreciate them on their own terms, imposing our expectations and frameworks rather than learning to see as the landscapes themselves might teach us to see. The Amazon viewed from within feels infinite. The forest stretches in every direction, apparently without end. Rivers wind through territory that seems unchanged for thousands of years. The sounds, the smells, the physical sensations of being in such a landscape are intense and overwhelming. It's easy to understand how someone could become captivated by such a place, devoted to unlocking its secrets, willing to risk everything to penetrate its mysteries. The landscapes Fawcett surveyed were his life's work. He spent years traveling through some of Earth's most challenging terrain, enduring hardships that would have broken many people, persisting in the face of difficulties that seemed insurmountable. His maps and reports expanded geographical knowledge. His observations contributed to anthropology and natural history. And his theories, however speculative, prompted questions that led eventually to better understanding. The green world persists, largely indifferent to human dramas played out within it. The rivers continue flowing, carrying water from the Andes to the Atlantic. The forests continue growing, with trees reaching toward light while their roots spread through the soil below. The indigenous peoples continue living in relationship with these landscapes, carrying knowledge systems developed over thousands of years. And occasionally, someone new arrives, drawn by curiosity or ambition or the simple desire to see such places with their own eyes. The Amazon's power lies not just in its scale but in its complexity. Every hectare contains more life than most people encounter in a lifetime of casual observation. The interactions between organisms and their physical environment create webs of relationships so intricate that we are still mapping their basic outlines despite decades of intensive study. This complexity is humbling, a reminder that human understanding, however advanced, remains incomplete. Fawcett understood some of this complexity through direct experience. He had walked through the forests, navigated the rivers, confronted the challenges. He had gained hard-won knowledge of how to survive in such places, what to watch for, what to avoid, how to read signs that informed people could interpret but that remained invisible to the uninitiated. This experiential knowledge, while limited compared to indigenous understanding, was nonetheless valuable and contributed to his ability to travel as far and as deeply as he did. The concept of terra preta, the black earth that so intrigued Fawcett, deserves deeper exploration. These soils, scattered across the Amazon basin in patches ranging from small garden plots to areas covering many hectares, represent one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in South America. The soils are distinctively dark, almost black, in sharp contrast to the typical reddish or yellowish clay of most Amazonian uplands. This color comes from charcoal and organic matter that has been incorporated into the soil. But terra preta is more than just dark soil. Chemical analysis reveals that these soils contain much higher concentrations of nutrients than surrounding soils. Phosphorus, calcium, nitrogen, and other elements essential for plant growth occur at levels that can be 10 or even 20 times higher than in adjacent areas. The soil structure is also different, with better water retention and more stable organic matter that doesn't quickly decompose. These characteristics make terra preta remarkably fertile, capable of supporting agriculture with minimal inputs even after centuries of abandonment. The formation of terra preta was not accidental. Indigenous peoples created these soils through deliberate management practices over long periods. They added charcoal from fires, creating the dark color and providing structure that helps retain nutrients. They incorporated organic waste, including plant materials, bones, shells, and other materials that decomposed slowly and released nutrients over time. They may have added ash from fires, which contributed calcium and other minerals. The process required consistent effort over decades or centuries, with multiple generations contributing to the soil's development. The discovery that indigenous peoples were actively managing soils and landscapes challenges the notion of the Amazon as pristine wilderness. Far from being passive inhabitants of an untamed forest, indigenous societies were actively shaping their environments, creating conditions favorable for the plants and animals they relied upon. The terra preta site suggests substantial, stable populations living in specific locations long enough to develop these enriched soils. This contradicts earlier assumptions that the Amazon's poor soils prevented permanent agriculture and limited population sizes. Fawcett's observations of terra preta, while not scientifically rigorous by modern standards, were perceptive. He recognized that these soils were unusual and likely indicated human presence. He noted their extent and their association with other archaeological features. Though he lacked the tools to fully investigate what these soils meant, he correctly intuited that they were evidence of past civilizations more complex than contemporary scholars believed possible. The geoglyphs of the Amazon, massive earthworks visible primarily from the air, represent another line of evidence that Fawcett could not have fully appreciated in his time. These features, which include geometric shapes such as circles, squares, and intricate patterns, were created by excavating ditches and piling the earth into embankments. Some geoglyphs cover areas of several hectares. They occur in patterns that suggest planning and coordination, implying social organization capable of mobilizing labor for large construction projects. The purpose of geoglyphs remains debated. Some may have had defensive functions, though the embankments are generally not high enough or steep enough to provide significant military advantages. Others may have been ceremonial spaces, enclosures for rituals or gatherings. Still others might have been symbolic, creating patterns meant to be seen by ancestral spirits or deities thought to observe from above. Whatever their purposes, the geoglyphs demonstrate that indigenous societies possessed the organization, labor force, and motivation to create lasting modifications to the landscape. Many geoglyphs are located in areas that are now deforested or partially deforested, which is how they became visible to aerial surveys. But LiDAR technology, which can penetrate forest canopy by using laser pulses, has revealed that many more geoglyphs exist beneath intact forest. The full extent of these earthworks is still being mapped, but it's clear that they are far more common than previously realized. The implication is that large areas of what appears to be pristine Amazon forest actually overlay landscapes that were extensively modified by human activity in the past. Fawcett would have walked past some of these features without recognizing them. From ground level, partially eroded embankments might appear to be natural ridges. Filled-in ditches might be imperceptible beneath vegetation. The geometric precision that is obvious from above is difficult to detect when you're standing in the middle of a feature that extends for hundreds of meters in every direction. Only by mapping the terrain carefully or viewing it from altitude do the patterns emerge. The indigenous peoples who created these earthworks and terra preta soils lived in societies that were larger and more complex than Europeans initially recognized. Early accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries described substantial villages and towns along the Amazon's major rivers. Some reports mentioned settlements stretching for kilometers, with large populations engaged in agriculture, fishing, and trade. But by the 18th century, when European penetration of the Amazon increased, these large settlements had vanished. The explanation lies in disease. European contact brought pathogens to which indigenous Americans had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases swept through populations with devastating effect. Mortality rates in some communities approached 90% or higher. Entire societies collapsed as people died faster than social structures could adapt. Villages were abandoned. Agricultural systems failed. Trade networks broke down. Within a few generations, the landscape had changed dramatically, with forest reclaiming areas that had been cleared and maintained for centuries. When later explorers and scientists visited the Amazon, they saw forests and assumed those forests were pristine, eternal, untouched by human influence. They saw small indigenous populations living in scattered villages and assumed that had always been the pattern. The idea that the Amazon had recently hosted much larger populations seemed impossible given the apparent poverty of the environment. This led to theories about environmental determinism, the belief that the Amazon's poor soils and challenging conditions necessarily limited human societies to small, simple forms. Fawcett's theories about lost civilizations, while often framed in terms that now seem romantic or speculative, were actually closer to historical reality than the academic consensus of his time. He was right that the Amazon had hosted large, complex societies. He was right that these societies had shaped the landscape extensively. He was right that the forest as he saw it was not as pristine as it appeared. Where he was wrong was in imagining stone cities and kingdoms along classical lines rather than recognizing that Amazonian civilizations had developed their own distinctive forms of social organization and landscape modification. The climate of the Amazon, beyond the basic pattern of high rainfall and temperature, shows variations that affected both the forest and the people living within it. The Amazon basin is large enough that different regions experience somewhat different climatic patterns. The western Amazon, nearest the Andes, receives moisture from both the Atlantic and from local evapotranspiration. Rainfall can exceed 4,000 mm per year in some areas, with no true dry season. This creates conditions of constant moisture, where streams flow year-round and the forest rarely experiences water stress. The central Amazon experiences more seasonal variation in rainfall. The wet season, roughly December through May, brings heavy regular rains. Rivers flood extensively, inundating vast areas of forest. The dry season, June through November, sees much less precipitation, though usually some rain still falls. Rivers drop to their dry season levels, exposing beaches and sandbars. The forest, while not experiencing true drought, does show signs of water stress during this period, with some trees shedding leaves and reduced growth rates. The southern Amazon, including the Mato Grosso region where Fawcett made many of his explorations, experiences the most pronounced seasonality. The dry season here can last 4 to 5 months with minimal rainfall. Streams and rivers drop significantly or dry up completely. The vegetation responds dramatically, with deciduous trees losing leaves and grasses drying to straw. Fire becomes common, both natural fires from lightning and fires set by people for land management. The landscape during the dry season can look almost desert-like in places, brown and parched, seemingly lifeless. But with the return of the rains, the transformation is rapid and complete, green returning within days as plants break dormancy and resume growth. These climatic variations create different opportunities and challenges for human inhabitants. The wettest regions, with year-round moisture, support the most productive forest but also present the most difficult conditions for travel and habitation. The seasonally dry regions are easier to travel through during the dry season and offer more opportunities for fire-based land management, but they also require strategies for coping with seasonal water scarcity and the risk of uncontrolled fires. Fawcett's expeditions typically took place during the dry season when travel was easier. Rivers were lower but still navigable. Forests were less waterlogged. Insects, while still abundant, were somewhat less overwhelming. But this timing also meant experiencing the Amazon during its least productive period, when food was potentially scarcer and water sources more limited. The indigenous peoples who hosted or encountered Fawcett were also dealing with dry season conditions, which may have affected their willingness or ability to share resources with visitors. The atmospheric conditions of the Amazon create distinctive sensory experiences. The humidity, almost always above 80% and often near 100%, makes the air feel thick and heavy. Breathing requires conscious effort at times, especially during exertion. Sweat doesn't evaporate efficiently in the saturated air, so cooling through perspiration is less effective than in drier climates. Everything feels damp to the touch. Clothes never fully dry. Equipment develops mildew within days if not carefully maintained. Papers become limp and fragile. Metal corrodes rapidly despite oiling. The heat, while not extreme by desert standards, becomes oppressive through its constancy. Daytime temperatures typically reach the low 30s Celsius, sometimes higher. But nighttime cooling is minimal due to cloud cover and humidity. Temperatures rarely drop below 20 degrees Celsius. This lack of temperature variation means the body never gets full relief from heat stress. After weeks or months of exposure, the constant warmth becomes wearing in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The light in the Amazon has qualities distinct from other environments. Under the forest canopy, light is filtered through multiple leaf layers, taking on a greenish tinge. The dimness requires eyes to adapt, pupils dilating to capture available photons. Movement is difficult to track in this low light, which may partly explain why forest animals are often heard rather than seen. Emerging from the forest into a clearing or onto a river is almost blinding, the contrast so sharp that it takes moments for vision to adjust. The storms of the Amazon are spectacular and can be terrifying. During the wet season, afternoon storms build with predictable regularity. The morning starts clear, but by midday, cumulus clouds begin forming. By early afternoon, these clouds have grown into towering thunderheads, their tops reaching into the stratosphere. The base of the clouds darkens to nearly black. Lightning flickers continuously within the clouds. Thunder rumbles, at first distant, then increasingly near. When the storm breaks, it does so with violence. Wind rushes through, bending trees, tearing branches, whipping the river into whitecaps. Rain follows, not as individual drops but as sheets of water, falling so heavily that visibility drops to meters. The roar of rain on vegetation and water is deafening, drowning out all other sounds. Lightning strikes are frequent and close, the flash and crack sometimes simultaneous, indicating strikes within meters. The entire world becomes water and noise and electrical discharge. These storms typically last 30 minutes to an hour, then pass as quickly as they arrived. The clouds move on, the rain stops, and the sun emerges. The forest drips for a while, water cascading from leaves, but within an hour, conditions return to normal. The river, swollen slightly from the runoff, continues its flow. The forest, refreshed, seems to green even more intensely. And by late afternoon, the air begins building again toward tomorrow's storm. Fawcett experienced countless such storms during his expeditions. They required planning and preparation. When possible, one tried to be safely encamped before the afternoon storm hit, with shelters erected and equipment protected. Being caught in open water during a storm was dangerous, with waves and wind threatening to capsize boats. Being caught on an exposed ridge was even worse, with the risk of lightning strikes. The indigenous peoples had developed strategies for coping with storms, knowing where to find shelter, how to read the sky and predict when storms would arrive, and how to protect themselves and their possessions from the deluge. The wind patterns of the Amazon, while generally light compared to other regions, do vary seasonally and affect the landscape. The prevailing winds come from the east, carrying moisture from the Atlantic across the basin. But local patterns develop in response to topography and temperature variations. Valley breezes flow upslope during the day as warming air rises, then reverse at night as cooling air drains downward. These local circulations can be significant enough to affect navigation and planning. The absence of strong winds in much of the Amazon means that trees don't develop the same structural reinforcements as trees in windier environments. This makes them more vulnerable to sudden windstorms when they do occur. Occasionally, intense downbursts associated with thunderstorms create localized areas of extreme wind, strong enough to flatten sections of forest. These wind throw events create large gaps in the canopy where dozens or hundreds of trees are knocked down in roughly the same direction. These gaps then become areas of intense regeneration, with fast-growing pioneer species racing to fill the opening before the canopy closes again. The sounds of the Amazon create an acoustic environment unlike anywhere else. During the day, bird calls dominate, from the haunting whistle of the screaming peaher to the raucous cries of parrots to the complex songs of wrens and antbirds. Monkey troops crash through the canopy, their movements announced by breaking branches and vocalizations. Insects hum and buzz continuously, a background that becomes so constant it fades from conscious awareness until it stops, at which point the sudden silence is startling. At night, the acoustic environment shifts. Most birds fall silent, though some owls and nightjars call. Frogs take over as the dominant voices, their calls ranging from melodious trills to harsh croaks to bizarre sounds that seem mechanical rather than biological. Some species produce calls so loud they cause physical discomfort at close range. The chorus can be overwhelming, a wall of sound that makes conversation difficult and sleep challenging for those not accustomed to it. But within this chaos is information. The indigenous peoples living in the forest learn to read the soundscape, detecting subtle changes that indicate approaching predators, weather shifts, or other significant events. A sudden silence spreading through the forest might indicate a large predator moving through. A change in bird alarm calls might signal human presence. The skills required to interpret these acoustic cues develop over years of immersion and attention, becoming almost subconscious in people who have lived their entire lives in the environment. Fawcett, despite his years of experience in the Amazon, likely never achieved the level of acoustic awareness that indigenous peoples possessed. He could recognize some obvious patterns, certainly. He learned to associate certain sounds with particular animals or events. But the subtle details, the slight variations that carried meaning to trained ears, probably eluded him. This limitation, shared by most outsiders, meant that the forest was always more mysterious, less predictable, than it was for those who truly knew it. The smells of the Amazon are distinctive and varied. The forest floor smells of decomposition, rich and earthy, sometimes almost fungal. The rivers smell of tannins and mud, with occasional whiffs of decay from stranded fish or other organic matter. After rain, a fresh smell rises from the soil and vegetation, clean and green. Flowering trees produce fragrances that can be detected from considerable distances, sweet or spicy depending on species. Some plants produce unpleasant odors, attracting flies or beetles as pollinators rather than bees or birds. The smell of wood smoke is common around human settlements. Indigenous peoples use fire for cooking, for warmth on cool nights, for pest control around houses, and for various ceremonial purposes. The smell of smoke, combined with the smells of food being prepared and the general odors of human habitation, creates a distinctive sensory signature that can be detected before a village comes into view. This allowed both travelers to know they were approaching settlement and allowed villagers to detect approaching visitors through smell as well as sight and sound. Fawcett's own expeditions would have produced their own odors. Unwashed bodies, mildewed clothing, cooking fires, and the smell of preserved food all combined into an aromatic trail. This likely affected interactions with indigenous peoples, who might have found the smells strange or unpleasant, just as Europeans often reacted negatively to the smells of indigenous people whose diets and hygiene practices differed from their own. The tactile experiences of the Amazon complete the sensory picture. The constant dampness makes everything feel slightly clammy. Fabrics cling to skin. Leather becomes soft and pliable but also prone to rot. Wood swells with absorbed moisture. The humidity makes even still air feel close and oppressive. Moving through vegetation means constant contact with leaves, branches, vines, and bark, each with its own texture. Some leaves are smooth and waxy. Others are rough or even abrasive. Some plants have hairs that irritate skin. Others have spines or thorns that catch clothing or puncture skin. The ground underfoot varies constantly. Firm soil gives way to mud without warning. Leaf litter conceals roots, holes, and obstacles. Walking requires constant attention and adjustment. The risk of twisting an ankle or falling is ever present. In swampy areas, each step sinks into soft substrate, requiring effort to extract one's foot for the next step. The physical toll of travel accumulates rapidly, with legs and feet protesting after hours of such conditions. The final legacy of Percy Fawcett's explorations of the Amazon is the reminder that some places remain wild, some mysteries remain unsolved, and some landscapes demand respect rather than conquest. The green world he entered and never left continues to inspire, to challenge, and to reward those who approach it with appropriate humility and wonder. The rivers still flow through endless forests. The seasons still cycle between wet and dry. The life that fills every niche continues its ancient patterns, little change despite human presence. And somewhere in that vastness, the answer to what happened to Percy Fawcett, Jack Fawcett, and Raleigh Rimmel remains hidden, absorbed into the landscape, perhaps never to be fully revealed. The Amazon keeps its secrets well, holding them close beneath its green canopy, letting them settle into the soil and the water and the accumulated leaves of 1,000 years. For those who venture into such places, there is always the chance of becoming part of the landscape themselves, joining the long history of people who came, saw, and remained forever part of the green world. If you found peace in tonight's journey through the Amazon, through the landscapes that shaped and ultimately claimed the explorer Percy Fawcett, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps create more of these explorations, these gentle voyages into history and landscape. And perhaps leave a comment sharing your thoughts about these places, about exploration and mystery, about the wild places that still exist in our increasingly known world. But for now, let your thoughts drift, let the images of green forests and flowing rivers carry you toward sleep. Rest well, knowing that somewhere the Amazon continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human concerns, magnificent in its persistence, eternal in its changeability. Sleep well.